Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The oppressive heat clung to me like a shroud as I lay motionless in my bunk, eyes boring into the mildewed ceiling. Sweat pooled in the hollow of my throat, mingling with the ever-present reek of stale cigarettes and hopelessness that permeated the barracks. In that moment, the only thing more suffocating than the Georgia summer was the weight of my own desperation. Private Ethan Burke. That was the name they'd given me when I walked into this godforsaken place a lifetime ago. Now it felt like a cruel joke, a jab at the boy I used to be. The one naive enough to believe I was destined for more than this slow death in the filth and misery of Fort Kilbourne. But that bright-eyed recruit might as well have died the day I decided I was done with this. Done with the endless drills, the sleepless nights, the gnawing isolation that ate me alive from the inside out. I wanted out, and I didn't care how I made that happen. When I first dared to whisper my intentions, my bunkmates and even the drill instructors laughed in my face. Told me I'd be trapped in this purgatory till long after the Christmas lights faded, if the chapter paperwork even went through at all. Their derision only sharpened my resolve to cut this nightmare short by any means necessary. It was Drill Sergeant Court who first planted the poisonous seed of an idea. He pulled me aside one sweltering evening, his nicotine-stained fingers digging into my shoulder. "Listen up, Burke," he rasped, breath hot and foul in my ear. "You really want to get gone? Forget the official channels. Go AWOL, hop the fence and hightail it out of here. Brass won't even bother coming after a grunt like you. They'll just stamp your papers and toss them in the mail." His words wriggled under my skin like parasites, growing and multiplying in the fetid corners of my mind. The rational part of my brain knew it was most likely a trap, the ravings of a sadist getting his kicks by toying with my sanity. But that voice drowned beneath the din of my mounting hysteria, my clawing need to be free of this hellhole. So I conspired with Jackson Cale, a hollow-eyed private from 3rd Platoon. We schemed in harsh whispers, heads bent together in the latrine under the flicker of dying fluorescent bulbs. The plan was deceptively simple. Wait for the witching hour, sneak past the night patrol, and follow the railway tracks north until we hit the highway. From there, we'd hitch a ride or jack a car, whatever it took to get far, far away. I barely slept in the days leading up to our fateful escape. Fear and exhilaration warred in my guts, a twisting knot of vipers that made each breath catch in my throat. When the appointed night finally arrived, a strange calm descended over me, an icy clarity, like I'd already accepted whatever grim fate lay ahead. Hour by hour, I watched the clock hands crawl, feigning sleep whenever the CQ poked his head in. The barracks slowly fell silent, save for the discordant symphony of snores and creaking bunks. When my watch hands kissed midnight, I slipped out of bed on cat's feet, fully dressed, boots in hand. Heart hammering a staccato rhythm against my ribs, I crept to the tree line where Cale and I agreed to rendezvous. But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of my co-conspirator, a leaden weight began to settle in my stomach. 15 minutes. 30. An hour. The woods stayed dark and silent, the crickets' droning chorus almost mockingly loud in the stillness. The truth crashed over me in icy waves. Cale had chickened out, or worse yet, sold me up the river. And it was far too late for me to slink back to my bunk unnoticed. I was committed now, for better or worse. Cursing under my breath, I laced up my boots with shaking hands and plunged into the unknown, making for the railroad tracks beyond the firebreak. Behind me, Fort Kilbourne's squat concrete buildings faded into the gloom, swallowed up by the hungry Georgia night. Unease prickled the back of my neck as I picked my way along the rails, the blackness pressing in from all sides. It felt as if the inky darkness had weight and substance, greedy fingers that pawed at my skin and probed at my mind. An owl screeched somewhere in the canopy, the eerie sound slicing through me like a razor. I walked for an eternity, no way to mark time except my own ragged breaths and the crunch of cinders beneath my boots. The muggy air was oppressive. beads of sweat snaking down my back. Foreboding crept up my spine with every step, the certainty that I had veered far off course, that the night and the wilds had swallowed me whole. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I veered off the train tracks, following an overgrown footpath into the heart of the forest. Thorny undergrowth snagged at my clothes, my skin, drawing blood and stifled curses. But I barely registered the sting. All-consuming dread had hold of me now, icy talons that raked my insides raw. The forest canopy blocked out all starlight, rendering me utterly blind. I groped ahead with trembling hands, recoiling every time my fingers brushed bark or vine. Time and direction lost all meaning in the primeval blackness. There was only the rasp of my breath, the throb of my pulse in my ears like a countdown to some fast-approaching doom. After a countless more steps, the trail spilled out into a clearing. Disoriented, I spun in a slow circle, desperate for any landmark, any clue to where I'd ended up. My eyes lit on a jumble of shapes across the glade, a dozen small structures, hunkered low to the ground. A thread of hope stitched my hammering heart. Civilization. Safety. I stumbled forward on rubbery legs, ready to collapse with relief. But that hope shriveled and died as soon as I got close enough to make out the details in the weak moonlight. They weren't houses at all, but training dummies. Weathered plywood cutouts. Vaguely man-shaped, pocked with bullet holes. Gaping dark eye sockets stared out from crudely painted faces, frozen in silent screams. The wind sighed through the maze of plywood and timber, the sound obscenely close to human moans drifting from the tree line all around. I clapped a hand over my mouth, battling a sudden wave of nausea. The sour tang of rot and old blood hung heavy in the air, stronger now that I was almost on top of the dummies. It was a scent I knew all too well from hours on the range. The stink of death. Gruesome visions flooded my mind unbidden. Phantasms of broken, mutilated bodies scattered in the dirt, empty eye sockets crawling with maggots. Of raw, red meat glistening under a cold white moon. Clamping down on a scream, I spun away and plunged back into the sheltering arms of the forest. But even once the dummies faded from view, I couldn't escape the sense of being watched, of being stalked by something ravenous and cruel, always just out of sight in the undergrowth. The nightmarish images lingered, branded on the backs of my eyelids. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed, heedless of the branches that scoured my face raw. Pure animal panic had me in its grip now. The silence of the forest pressed down like a smothering hand, the darkness a living thing snapping at my heels. I imagined grasping claws, gnashing teeth, blazing inhuman eyes boring into my soul. A glint of silver stopped me dead in my tracks. There, crouched between two pines mere yards away, was the most monstrous creature I had ever seen. In build it resembled a coyote, but one that had crawled out of the depths of hell. Its fur was gone, leaving only sickly grayish skin that stretched drum-tied over jutting ribs and vertebrae. Weeping sores pocked its whole body. Worst of all were its eyes. Milky, clouded orbs shot through with inky black veins that seemed to pulse in time with my own frantic heartbeat. The thing opened its maw, revealing a forest of jagged fangs that dripped with rank saliva. A low, unearthly keening spilled out, scraping along my nerve endings like shards of glass. I could feel the sound worming into my brain, oily tendrils seeking purchase. I wanted to run, to scream, to beg whatever gods might hear me for salvation, but my limbs had turned to stone, my voice to ashes in my throat. I could only stare into those hellish eyes, mesmerized as a mouse before a cobra. The staring contest stretched for a short, searing eternity. Then the thing slunk back into the brush as suddenly as it appeared, its grotesque form melting into the shadows. The keening cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so absolute it made my ears ring. Released from my paralysis, I turned and fled back the way I had come, flying over the uneven ground with strength born of pure adrenaline. I didn't dare look behind me, certain I would see that nightmarish silhouette loping along in my wake, just waiting for me to stumble. I didn't slow down until the muscles in my legs turned to water and my lungs heaved like a bellows. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, there was nothing but the black maw of the night. But I could still feel unseen eyes on me, the phantom pressure of a predator's gaze. Exhaustion dragged at my eyelids and sanity alike. I longed to curl up in the moss and slip into oblivion, to wake in my bunk back at Kilbourne and discover this had all been a fever dream. But the icy fingers of intuition told me if I surrendered now, I would never open my eyes again. The ghost of my drill instructor's voice echoed in my ears, drowned out the gibbering whispers of my own failing reason. "Stay alert, stay alive," he would snarl at us during night drills. So I dredged up the tattered remnants of my resolve and fixed my eyes on the one pinprick of light in the distance, a blinking red beacon atop a radio tower, just visible above the treetops. Maybe it was a mast set up for field training ops, some small outpost of sanity in this endless wilderness. Or maybe it was another hallucination, a trick of my fracturing mind. I couldn't be sure of anything anymore except the driving need to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to keep clawing my way forward until I outran the darkness, howling at the edges of my consciousness. So I lurched ahead, chasing that crimson point, barely noticing when the uneven forest floor gave way to a dry and rocky streambed. The streambed seemed to unspool into eternity before me, an endless throat of stone and shadow. The radio tower that had been my lodestar quickly vanished, swallowed by the dense canopy. Without that guiding light, the darkness crowded in until it felt like a crushing weight on my chest. Every rasping inhale took immense effort, as if the air had turned to tar in my lungs. A gnarled tree had fallen across the path up ahead, form ominous bulk blotting out the faint moonlight. Half blind and near mindless with exhaustion, I nearly ran headlong into it before my brain registered the obstacle. Stifling a sob of frustration, I sank to the rocky ground and buried my head in my hands. Despair crashed over me in black waves, dragging me down into suffocating depths. Escape from this hell forest seemed as distant and impossible as the moon overhead. The last ember of hope in my chest sputtered and dimmed, nearly dead. A sudden explosion of movement shattered my spiraling thoughts. Rustling erupted from both sides of the stream bank, converging on my position. Heart in my throat, I scrambled upright and pressed my back against the fallen tree. My scream caught barbs in my throat as three skeletal shapes burst out of the brush. More of the monstrous coyotes, furless and seeping as the first one. Their reek preceded them, overripe meat and fetid pond scum. 3 pairs of filmy eyes bored into mine, glazed with berserk hunger, jaws peeled back from needle fangs and rictus grins. They fanned out in a semicircle, cutting off all routes of escape. My pulse roared like a freight train in my ears, almost drowning out their sickening mewls. I scrabbled at the bark behind me. Pain distant as splinters pierced my skin. A desperate thought pierced the static of my terror. If I could haul myself on top of the trunk, the height might give me some advantage against their slavering jaws. Sucking in a shuddering breath, I tensed to leap. But at that instant, the lead beast lunged. I hurled myself sideways, hitting the creek bed hard. Claws scrabbled on the shale inches from my face. Putrid breath gusted over me. Somehow I rolled to my feet and tore downstream, chased by the staccato of nails on stone and a rising howl that turned my spine to ice. Brittle branches whipped my face as I crashed through the undergrowth. My world narrowed to the ragged in and out of my breath, the burn in my legs and lungs. Behind me, the baying took on a frenzied pitch, spurring me to an impossible breakneck speed. But I knew with leaden certainty that I couldn't outrun them for long. Not in unfamiliar terrain, weak with hunger and fatigue, my body near the limits of human endurance. The sick anticipation of teeth in my hamstring, my throat, rose like bile in my gullet. Just as I felt their fetid pants on my heels, my bloodshot eyes snagged on a low-hanging branch up ahead. Desperately, I gathered the dregs of my strength and leapt, catching the limb and hauling myself up hand over hand, tendons straining. I clambered up and up until the boughs thinned dangerously, threatening to snap under my weight. Only then did I dare glance back at the forest floor, and nearly lost my grip at what I saw. Nothing. No sign of the hellish pack, not even stirred undergrowth to mark their passing. They had vanished like phantoms between one blink and the next. Hallucination or reality, I no longer knew, nor did it matter. All that mattered was that the hounds of hell no longer bayed at my heels. I draped myself over the tree limb, every muscle quivering from exertion and the aftermath of adrenaline overload. In the deafening silence, my own harsh breathing sounded obscenely loud. I pressed a fist to my mouth, terrified it would draw the nightmares back to me. Hysteria bubbled in my chest, black and poison. Strangling it down took the last dregs of my will. So I clung there, cheek pressed to the rough bark, floating in that narrow space between oblivion and madness. Time ceased, narrowed to the throb of my pulse, the creak of branch and groan of wood that could have been the creak of my own bones. Light seeped into existence by degrees, turning the underbellies of leaves from gray to silver to pale, washed-out green. The diffuse glow revealed a canopy stretching out in all directions, an ocean of limbs without end. In the light of dawn, it seemed a normal enough forest. But I knew better now, could feel the watchful malice that lurked in its depths. The reckoning sunrise brought no relief, no release from the sense of being stalked by ravenous shadows. If anything, the gray light trickling through the canopy only sharpened my unease, threw the forest's eerie silence into high relief. No birdsong pierced the gloom, no skitter of small creatures in the undergrowth. Every inch of my body ached, muscles stiff and joints swollen from a night spent contorted in my arboreal refuge. Gingerly, I disentangled myself from the branches and half slid, half fell to the forest floor. Briar thorns and jagged rocks bit into my palms, my knees. I welcomed the pain, clung to it like an anchor against the tide of creeping dread. Fighting down a groan, I hauled myself upright by a tree trunk, bark rough under my scrabbling fingers. My head swam, stomach cramping viciously from too many hours without food or water. The few sips left in my canteen did little to wet my parched throat. I lifted my chin and inhaled deeply through my nose, trying to catch any hint of petrichor that might signify water nearby. But the air lay dead and stagnant in my nostrils, devoid of any sign of life or hope. Despair pressed down on me like a living thing, bleak and hungry. Even if I kept trudging forward, even if I somehow evaded the monstrous predators that lurked in the woods, I knew my time was running short. Without water, I wouldn't last another day. The irony of it, after all I'd endured, made me want to scream until my throat bled and the sky cracked open. Instead, I chose a direction at random and began walking, each step a Herculean effort. Dry leaves cracked underfoot, startlingly loud in the hushed timelessness of the forest. For a while, I drifted, insensible, no thought in my head beyond the rhythmic swish and thud of my own strides, the throb of my pulse behind my eyes like a second heartbeat. After a timeless interval, a new sound elbowed its way into my consciousness, a whispery susurrus that raised the hairs up and down my arms, sent ancient instincts gibbering warnings in the primal depths of my brain. I froze mid-stride, skin prickling with unnameable recognition. The sound drifted closer on a breath of fetid wind, resolving into a liquid chitter that was somehow both insectile and horribly, viscerally human. Something deep in my lizard hindbrain knew that sound, remembered it from a time before memory, before thought. Revulsion rolled through me in a black wave. "Please!" A rasping voice called out suddenly, far too close. "Help me!" The words shattered me out of my paralysis. I spun toward the voice, heart battering itself bloody against my ribcage. A figure crouched against the bole of an enormous oak, limbs folded in on itself in an attitude of unnatural, bone-deep weakness. rags the same washed-out gray as the tree bark hung off its emaciated frame. "Please," it whispered again, words whistling through a ruined throat. "I've been lost so long." "Stay back," I snarled, voice cracking. I pawed at my empty holster, cursing myself for not keeping my sidearm. "Don't come any closer." "You don't understand," it gasped, unfolding spider-like limbs to raise stick-thin arms in supplication. "This place, it unmakes you, unmakes everything." Its face lifted into a shaft of watery light, and I recoiled, gorge rising. The features were barely human, pitted and eroded like a clay sculpture left to the elements. Teeth gleamed through the tatters of its cheeks, eyes sunken to dark pits in its skull. A choked whimper escaped my own throat. I tried to warn them. It babbled on, skeletal fingers clicking and clutching. Tried to make them see. But they wouldn't listen. And the forest took them. Takes everyone in the end. The mad ramblings crashed over me, nonsensical yet ringing with a terrible, undeniable truth. Pressure built behind my eyes, clawed up my throat thick and choking. I backed away, brambles catching at my ankles, as the thing shambled closer, still babbling. They thought they could tame it, control it. But it was here long before them. Before any of us. A gurgling, mirthless laugh. "Once you set foot in these woods, there's no way out. No reprieve. It gets inside, you see." The last fraying thread of my self-control snapped. I turned and crashed back into the underbrush, thorny tendrils shredding my skin, my sanity. Behind me, the ruined voice rose in a keening wail, words lost in a crescendo of despair. I ran until the sound faded, and there was only my own ragged breath and the endless green twilight. Time lost meaning, devoured by the nightmare forest. More than once, I caught glimpses of other figures flitting between the trees, heard snatches of their gibbering pleas. Whether they were real or just hallucinations spun from my crumbling psyche, I no longer knew or cared. I felt the trees watching me too now, their eyeless regard tracking my every stumbling step. Grasping roots rose up to snag my boots, and grasping branches blotted out the feeble light. Madness perched on my shoulder, crooning wordless insanities in my ear. The forest had swallowed me whole, and soon there would be nothing left of the man named Ethan Burke. Only the distant blare of a truck horn saved me from succumbing entirely. The sound crashed over me like a bucket of ice water, driving back the whispering shadows. For a single crystalline moment, reality reasserted itself. The forest was just a forest. The lurking horrors just phantoms of a brain pushed to and beyond its limits. Galvanized, I staggered toward the sound, trampling through the undergrowth with the last of my failing strength. Asphalt appeared underfoot, so sudden it sent me sprawling. I lay on the sun-baked shoulder, twitching, until the crunch of tires on gravel made me raise my head. An MP climbed out of a camo-painted Jeep, oiled rifle pointed at my center mass. I had never been so glad to stare down the barrel of a gun. Weeping, I struggled to my knees, hands raised. The young soldier was shouting, demanding my name and what the hell I was doing out here. Words spilled out of me in a jumbled rush. Court-martial, psyche eval, dishonorable discharge. I would welcome them all like old friends. Anything to escape the yawning madness at my back. Already the forest's pull was reasserting itself, dark tendrils twining around the ragged edges of my mind. The soldier hauled me up, snapped a pair of zip ties around my filthy wrists. I hardly felt the plastic cutting into my flesh. As the Jeep peeled away in a cloud of dust and exhaust, I twisted to stare out the rear window, needing a final glimpse. But the trees had already closed ranks behind us, swallowing the secrets of their rotten heart. I would carry a piece of that fathomless dark inside me for the rest of my days. In every shadow, ever darkened room, it would whisper to me in my dreams and paint my waking world in shades of dread. A stain on my soul, the price of my survival. But in that moment, as Fort Kilburn's towers and razor wire scrolled into view, I pushed those grim thoughts away. There would be a lifetime to reckon with what I had seen, what I had become. For now, I let my head loll back against the seat, closed my eyes, and sent up a silent prayer for the boy I used to be. The one who had marched into those woods and never come marching out. The crisp autumn air nipped at my exposed skin as I trudged up the familiar path, my boots crunching against the gravel and fallen leaves. It was September 2019, and at 23 years old, I felt invincible. The world was my playground, and this mountain, this glorious, untamed beast of nature, was my personal kingdom. My name is James, and I've lived in the shadow of Mount Blackridge my entire life. Our quiet suburban neighborhood nestled at its base, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed slopes that loomed above us. For as long as I can remember, the mountain had been calling to me, its siren song of adventure and mystery impossible to resist. As I hiked upward, my friends Noah and Zoe flanked me on either side. We'd been inseparable since childhood, bound together by our shared love of exploration and the outdoors. Over the years, we'd become intimately familiar with every nook and cranny of Mount Blackridge, or so we thought. "Hey, James," Noah called out, his voice slightly breathless from the exertion. "Remember when we first started clearing this trail?" I grinned, recalling the countless hours we'd spent hacking away at the dense underbrush, carving out our own secret path up the mountain. How could I forget? We were what, 16? Thought we were real trailblazers. Zoe chuckled, her long dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. More like idiots with too much time on our hands, but I have to admit, it was worth it. Our trail was a thing of beauty, hidden from the main path, known only to us. It wound its way up the mountainside, offering breathtaking views and a sense of solitude that was impossible to find on the more popular routes. We'd spent countless weekends exploring, pushing further and further up the mountain, always hungry for what lay just around the next bend. As we climbed higher, the forest around us grew denser, the canopy overhead blocking out much of the afternoon sun. Shadows danced between the trees, and the air grew cooler, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. "Hold up, guys," I said, reaching for my backpack. "Let's take a breather. I want to get some shots of this place." I pulled out my camera, a graduation gift from my parents, and began framing up some shots of the surrounding forest. The play of light and shadow, the vibrant autumn colors, the gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It was a photographer's dream. Oh God, not another photo shoot. Noah groaned good-naturedly. How about something a little more entertaining? With an exaggerated eye roll, he struck a ridiculous pose, gyrating his hips and waving his arms in what I could only assume was his attempt at dancing. Zoe burst out laughing, and I couldn't help but join in as I switched the camera to video mode. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced in my best documentary voice, "we present to you the mating dance of the wild mountain idiot. Notice the spasmodic movements, designed to attract a mate, or possibly scare off predators." We were all in stitches, the sound of our laughter echoing through the trees. It was a perfect moment. 3 friends, far from the cares of the world, enjoying each other's company and the beauty of nature. If only we had known then how quickly that perfection would shatter. As Noah continued his ridiculous dance, with Zoe now joining in, I panned the camera around, capturing the scene. The lens swept across the dense undergrowth, the towering trees, the narrow path behind us. And that's when I saw it. Just for a split second, barely long enough to register, a dark shape moved in the background. It was gone so quickly that I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all. I lowered the camera, squinting into the forest behind us. "Hey guys," I said, my voice suddenly tense. "Did you see that?" Noah and Zoe stopped their antics, looking at me with confusion. "See what?" Zoe asked, her brow furrowed. I shook my head, trying to shake off the sudden unease that had settled over me. "I don't know. I thought I saw something move back there. Probably just a deer or something." Noah peered into the woods, then shrugged. "I don't see anything, man. This mountain's playing tricks on your eyes." I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Yeah, you're probably right. Come on, let's keep going. We're almost to the top." As we continued our ascent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest, which had always felt like a welcoming second home, now seemed to press in around us. The shadows between the trees looked deeper, more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination running wild. But as we climbed higher, the feeling only intensified. More than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. By the time we reached the end of our trail, nearly an hour later, my nerves were frayed. The view from the top, which usually filled me with awe and exhilaration, now seemed tainted. As Noah and Zoe marveled at the landscape spread out before us, I found myself scanning the forest edge, looking for any sign of movement. "Earth to James," Zoe's voice cut through my thoughts. "You okay? You've been acting weird since we stopped for that video." I forced a smile, not wanting to worry my friends. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. Maybe we should head back down." The descent was quicker than the climb, but no less unsettling. Every step felt wrong, like we were being watched, stalked. By the time we reached the base of the mountain and parted ways, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. That night, as I sat at my computer, uploading the day's photos and videos, the unease returned full force. I watched the video of Noah's dance, smiling despite myself at his ridiculous moves. But as the camera panned, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the background, unmistakable this time, a man. He was partially obscured by the trees, but I could clearly make out his shape. He was standing perfectly still, watching us from about 20 meters away. My hands shook as I rewound the video, playing it again and again. How had we not seen him? How had he gotten there, on a trail that we ourselves had made, hours from any established path? As the implications sank in, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. We had been followed, watched, and we had never even known it. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, silent and motionless, observing us from the shadows. And I couldn't shake the terrifying question that kept running through my mind. If he had been there that day, how many other times had we been watched without knowing it? The revelation of our unseen watcher haunted me in the days that followed. I debated whether to tell Noah and Zoe, torn between wanting to warn them and not wanting to shatter their sense of security. In the end, my concern for their safety won out. We met at our favorite coffee shop, a cozy little place called The Roasted Bean, just a few blocks from the base of Mount Blackridge. As I recounted what I'd seen in the video, I watched their expressions change from disbelief to concern to outright fear. "Are you sure, James?" Noah asked, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a tense frown. "Maybe it was just a hiker who wandered off the main trail." I shook my head vehemently. "No way. Our trail is miles from any established path, and the way he was just standing there, watching us, it wasn't normal, Noah." Zoe had gone pale, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "What do we do? Should we report it to the police?" "And tell them what?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair in frustration. "That we saw a man in the background of a video on a trail we made ourselves, which technically we weren't supposed to do. They'd laugh us out of the station." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. It was Noah who finally broke the tension. "Well, I'm not giving up our trail," he said, a hint of defiance in his voice. "But maybe we should take some precautions. What if we brought Duke with us next time?" Duke was Noah's family's Saint Bernard, a massive, gentle giant of a dog who was fiercely protective of those he considered his pack. The idea of having him with us on the trail was immediately comforting. "That's actually not a bad idea," I admitted. "Duke would definitely let us know if anyone was around." Zoe nodded, some of the color returning to her cheeks. "And no one in their right mind would mess with us with Duke around. It's perfect." And so, a week later, we found ourselves back on our trail, this time with Duke lumbering along beside us. His presence was reassuring, his keen senses alert for any sign of danger. As we climbed, I felt some of the tension that had been coiled inside me begin to ease. But Mount Blackridge wasn't done with us yet. About 2 hours into our hike, as we paused to catch our breath and give Duke some water, a sound echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a low, undulating moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Noah whispered, his eyes wide. Duke's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound came again, louder this time, sending shivers down my spine. "Maybe it's just the wind," Zoe suggested, but her voice trembled slightly. I shook my head. "No wind today, and I've never heard the wind make a sound like that." We stood frozen, listening intently. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every living creature was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. "Okay, that was creepy as fuck," Noah muttered. "Maybe we should head back." Part of me wanted to agree, to flee back down the mountain to the safety of civilization. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to the mysteries of this place, wanted to push on, to uncover the source of that haunting sound. "Let's keep going," I said, surprising even myself. "But stay close, and keep an eye on Duke. If he acts up, we turn back immediately." As we continued our ascent, the atmosphere changed. The forest, which had always felt alive with the rustle of leaves and the calls of birds, now seemed oppressively silent. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing the sound. Duke stayed close to us, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a watchful alertness. More than once he stopped suddenly, ears pricked forward, staring intently into the undergrowth. Each time we'd freeze, hearts pounding, straining to see or hear what had caught his attention. But there was never anything there, at least nothing we could perceive. As we neared the 4-hour mark of our hike, we came upon a small clearing we'd never noticed before. The trees here were older, their gnarled trunks twisted into bizarre shapes. At the center of the clearing stood a massive oak, its branches reaching out like grasping fingers. And at the base of that oak was a gravestone. We approached cautiously, Duke whining softly at our heels. The stone was old, weathered by countless seasons, but the inscription was still legible. Margarito Esperanza, 1823, 1867. In the heart of the mountain, he found his peace. "What the hell?" Noah breathed, voicing the shock we all felt. "How is there a grave out here? There's no way anyone could have carried a body this far up the mountain." I ran my fingers over the worn stone, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. "And look at the date. This grave is over 150 years old." Zoe had her phone out, furiously tapping away. "Guys, listen to this. I found an old news article. Margarito Esperanza was a Spanish explorer who came to this area in the mid-1800s. He was obsessed with the idea that there was some kind of hidden treasure in these mountains. He spent years searching, and then one day he just disappeared. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard that low, moaning sound again. Duke whimpered, pressing himself against Noah's leg. "We should go," I said, the words coming out in a rush. Now. No one argued. We practically ran down the mountain, Duke bounding ahead of us as if he couldn't get away fast enough. It wasn't until we reached the base, our lungs burning and legs shaking, that we finally stopped to catch our breath. Okay, Noah panted. I think it's official. Our mountain is fucking haunted. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the idea as ridiculous. But after what we'd seen and heard, I couldn't bring myself to deny it. Something was out there, something that defied rational explanation. As we parted ways that evening, promising to meet up the next day to discuss what we'd discovered, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line. We had stumbled upon something old, something secret, and I feared that by doing so, we had set something in motion that we couldn't stop. That night, my dreams were filled with moaning winds and grasping tree branches, and through it all, a figure watched from the shadows, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The discovery of Margarito Esperanza's grave shook us to our core, but it also ignited a fierce curiosity that none of us could ignore. Despite the fear that lingered from our previous encounters on the mountain, we found ourselves drawn back time and time again, driven by an insatiable need to uncover more of Mount Blackridge's secrets. It was on one of these expeditions, about a month after finding the grave, that we stumbled upon something that would change everything. We had ventured off our usual trail, pushing deeper into uncharted territory. The terrain here was rougher, the undergrowth denser, and more than once we had to backtrack to find a passable route. Duke, who had become a constant companion on our hikes, seemed unusually agitated, whining softly and sticking close to our heels. Maybe we should turn back, Zoe suggested, eyeing Duke's behavior with concern. He clearly doesn't like it here. I was about to agree when Noah, who had pushed slightly ahead, called out, "Guys, you need to see this." We hurried forward, pushing through a tangle of branches and emerged into a small clearing. And there, set into the face of a rocky outcropping, was a cave entrance. But this was no ordinary cave. The opening was framed by a wooden door, ancient and weathered, its surface scarred by countless years of exposure to the elements. Heavy iron fittings, now rusted and pitted, held the door in place. Holy shit, I breathed, unable to believe what I was seeing. How is this even possible? Noah approached the door cautiously, running his hand over the rough wood. This thing looks hundreds of years old. Who the hell would build a door way out here? Zoe's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Do you think, could this have something to do with Margarito Esperanza? Maybe this is what he was looking for? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. If this cave was indeed connected to the Spanish explorer whose grave we'd found, what other secrets might it hold? Duke whined again, more insistently this time, tugging at his leash as if trying to pull us away from the cave. But our curiosity was too strong to be denied. Should we try to open it? Noah asked, his hand already reaching for the rusted iron handle. Wait, I said, grabbing his arm. We don't know what's in there. It could be dangerous. Zoe nodded in agreement. James is right. We should come back with proper equipment. Flashlights, at least. Maybe some rope. Noah looked disappointed, but relented. Reluctantly, we agreed to return another day, better prepared. As we made our way back down the mountain, our minds raced with possibilities. What lay behind that ancient door? What secrets had been hidden away for centuries, waiting to be discovered? The next week dragged by agonizingly slowly. We gathered supplies, powerful flashlights, rope, first aid kits, and extra batteries. The night before our planned return to the cave, I barely slept, my dreams filled with visions of dark passages and hidden treasures. When we finally set out, the air was thick with anticipation. Even Duke seemed to sense the importance of our mission, trotting along beside us with an unusual solemnity. As we neared the cave, that now familiar sense of unease settled over us. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. More than once I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At last we reached the clearing. The ancient door stood before us, somehow even more imposing in the harsh light of day. Noah stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the iron handle. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to echo through the very bones of the mountain, the door began to move. Decades, perhaps centuries of rust and decay fought against us, but slowly, inexorably, the door swung open. A blast of stale, musty air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of age and secrets long buried. We stood frozen, peering into the inky blackness beyond the threshold. "Well," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence, "we didn't come all this way to stand around staring." I clicked on my flashlight and stepped forward. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough stone walls that glistened with moisture. The floor was uneven, littered with small rocks and debris. Noah and Zoe followed close behind, their own lights joining mine to push back the shadows. Duke whined softly but stayed by our side, his nails clicking against the stone floor. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the mountain. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint drip of water echoing from somewhere ahead. "Look," Zoe whispered, pointing her light at the wall. There, barely visible beneath years of grime, were strange markings, symbols and pictographs unlike anything I'd ever seen before. "What do you think they mean?" Noah asked, running his fingers over the carvings. Before anyone could answer, a sound reached our ears. A low rhythmic thumping, like a giant heartbeat pulsing through the rock around us. Duke growled, the hair on his back standing on end. The thumping grew louder, filling the narrow passage until I could feel it vibrating in my chest. "Maybe we should go back," Zoe said, her voice tight with fear. But even as she spoke, the passage behind us filled with a thick, roiling mist. It crept towards us, tendrils reaching out as if alive. "Run!" I shouted, and we plunged forward into the darkness. Our footsteps echoed off the stone walls as we ran, the mist nipping at our heels. The passage seemed endless, twisting and turning, leading us ever deeper into the mountain's embrace. Suddenly, the narrow corridor opened up into a vast chamber. Our flashlight beams seemed pitiful against the immense darkness, barely illuminating the space immediately around us. "What is this place?" Noah gasped, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. As our eyes adjusted, details began to emerge from the gloom. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen in the passage. At its center stood a stone altar, and upon that altar— "Oh my God," Zoe whispered. There, bathed in a shaft of pale light that seemed to come from nowhere, lay a skeleton. It was clearly ancient, the bones yellowed with age, but somehow preserved in perfect articulation. Clutched in its bony hands was a book, its leather cover cracked and peeling. With trembling hands, I reached out and carefully lifted the book. As I did, a piece of parchment fluttered to the ground. Noah picked it up, his flashlight illuminating spidery handwriting. "I, Margarito Esperanza, have found what I sought for so long, but the price was more than I ever imagined. To those who follow, I beg you, turn back. Some secrets are not meant to be uncovered. The heart of the mountain beats with an ancient power, and it hungers. God forgive me for what I've awakened." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words over Noah's shoulder. The thumping sound, which had faded as we ran, suddenly returned full force. The very air seemed to vibrate with it. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely audible over the pulsing rhythm. "Now." But as we turned to flee, we found our exit blocked. The mist had caught up to us, swirling and churning at the chamber's entrance. And in that mist, shapes began to form, humanoid figures reaching out with ghostly hands. Duke barked furiously, placing himself between us and the apparitions. But his brave display did little to stop their advance. "There!" Zoe shouted, pointing to a narrow opening on the far side of the chamber. "Another passage!" We ran, Duke at our heels, the mist and its ghostly occupants giving chase. The new passage was steeper, leading upward in a dizzying spiral. Our lungs burned, muscles screaming in protest, but terror drove us onward. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, a glimmer of light appeared ahead. With a final burst of speed, we burst out of the mountain's grip, emerging onto a ledge high above the forest. We collapsed, gasping for air, as the cave entrance behind us filled with mist. For a moment, I thought I saw a face in that swirling vapor, ancient, malevolent, and hungry. Then it was gone, the mist dissipating in the sunlight. As we sat there trying to process what had just happened, I became aware that I still clutched Margarito's book in my hands. Despite every instinct screaming at me to throw it away, to leave it, and all it represented behind, I found myself unable to let it go. The descent from the mountain was a blur. We moved as if in a trance, our minds still reeling from what we'd experienced in the depths of that ancient cave. By the time we reached the base, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. We parted ways without much discussion, each of us needing time to process the impossible events of the day. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ghostly figures in the mist, heard the relentless thumping that seemed to echo the beating of some monstrous heart. The book lay on my desk, a silent reminder of our ordeal. Despite my exhaustion, I found myself drawn to it. With trembling hands, I opened its ancient pages, revealing line after line of text in a language I didn't recognize. Interspersed with the writing were diagrams and illustrations, star charts, anatomical drawings of creatures that couldn't possibly exist, and maps of cave systems that seemed to span impossible distances. As the first light of dawn crept through my window, I finally succumbed to exhaustion, slipping into a fitful sleep filled with disjointed dreams of darkness and ancient secrets. The next few days passed in a haze. We met up at the Roasted Bean, our usual haunt, but our conversations were stilted, haunted by the weight of what we'd experienced. Noah seemed determined to rationalize it all, coming up with increasingly far-fetched explanations for what we'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of natural gas, he suggested, his voice lacking conviction. It could have caused hallucinations. Zoe, on the other hand, had thrown herself into research, poring over every scrap of information she could find about Mount Blackridge and its history. "There are legends," she told us, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "Stories of the indigenous people who lived here long before European settlers arrived. They spoke of the mountain as a place of power, a gateway to other worlds." I listened to their theories, but my mind was elsewhere. The book consumed my thoughts. I'd spent hours trying to decipher its contents, but the language remained impenetrable. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding its secrets was somehow crucial. It was about a week after our cave expedition that things took an even stranger turn. I was walking home late one night, having lost track of time at the local library while researching ancient languages. The streets were deserted. The only sound the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through the trees. As I passed by a darkened alley, a figure stepped out of the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat, but before I could react, the stranger spoke. "You've seen it, haven't you? The heart of the mountain." The voice was old, cracked with age, but there was an undercurrent of strength to it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I made out the features of an elderly woman. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Someone who knows the weight of secrets, young man. Someone who has carried that burden for far too long." She stepped closer, and I caught the scent of herbs and something older, earthier. The book you found, it's not just a record, it's a key. And now that you've taken it, things have been set in motion that cannot be undone. A chill ran down my spine. How do you know about the book? I know many things, she replied cryptically. I know that the mountain has awakened, and it hungers. I know that you and your friends have stumbled into a war that has raged for centuries, hidden from the eyes of the world. She reached out, her gnarled hand grasping my arm with surprising strength. Listen carefully, boy. The answers you seek are not in that book. They're in the land itself, in the bones of those who came before. Find the truth before it's too late, or the darkness will consume everything. With that, she released me and melted back into the shadows of the alley. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of her words. When I finally made it home, I found Noah and Zoe waiting for me, their faces pale and drawn. Something's happened, Zoe said, her voice trembling. We need to talk. As I sat down with Noah and Zoe, the weight of their unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Noah's usually cheerful demeanor was gone, replaced by a haunted look that sent a chill through me. Zoe's hands trembled as she clutched a steaming mug of tea, her knuckles white with tension. What's going on? I asked, dreading the answer. Noah took a deep breath. It's Duke. He's gone missing. The words hit me like a physical blow. Duke, our loyal companion who had stood by us through every strange and terrifying moment on the mountain, was gone. When? How? I stammered. 2 days ago, Zoe explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah's family has been searching everywhere. They've put up posters called the shelters. Nothing. Noah's voice cracked as he continued. But that's not the worst part. Last night I heard something outside my window. When I looked out, I saw... He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the memory. What did you see? I pressed, although part of me didn't want to know. It looked like Duke, Noah said, his eyes meeting mine. But it wasn't. Its eyes were wrong, glowing in the darkness, and it moved in a way that no dog should be able to move. When it saw me watching, it smiled. Then it was gone. A heavy silence fell over us. The implications of what Noah had seen were too terrible to contemplate. Had the mountain somehow twisted Duke, turned our faithful friend into something unnatural? Before I could respond, a sharp knock at the door made us all jump. Heart pounding, I went to answer it, half expecting to see the nightmarish version of Duke that Noah had described. Instead, I found myself face to face with a man in a police uniform. His weathered face was grim, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. James, right? He asked. When I nodded, he continued. I'm Officer Reeves. I'm investigating a series of unusual occurrences in the area. I was told you and your friends might have some information that could help. I hesitated, looking back at Noah and Zoe. Their faces mirrored my own uncertainty. How much should we tell? Would anyone even believe us if we shared the full truth of what we'd experienced? Officer Reeves seemed to sense our reluctance. His voice softened slightly as he said, Look, I know this might sound strange, but I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen things on that mountain that I can't explain. Whatever's happening now, it's bigger than anything we've dealt with before. We need all the help we can get. Something in his tone, the hint of desperation beneath the professional exterior, made up my mind. I stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. You'd better come in, officer. It's a long story. Over the next few hours, we laid it all out. The hidden trail, the watcher in the woods, the eerie sounds, the cave with its ancient door, the chamber with Margarito's skeleton, and the ghostly pursuit that followed. We told him about Duke's disappearance and Noah's unsettling sighting. Throughout it all, Officer Reeves listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. When we finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything we'd shared. Finally, he spoke. "I believe you." The relief I felt at those 3 simple words was overwhelming. After days of feeling like we were losing our minds, here was someone who accepted the impossible reality we'd stumbled into. "There have been other incidents," Officer Reeves continued. "Hikers gone missing, only to return days later with no memory of where they'd been. Strange lights seen on the mountain at night. Animals behaving erratically. And always that sound, like a giant heartbeat echoing through the town." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Whatever's happening, it's escalating. And I think you 3 might be the key to understanding it all." As if on cue, a low, pulsing sound began to fill the air. It was faint at first, but grew steadily louder. The now familiar rhythm that we'd heard in the depths of the mountain. Officer Reeves paled. "It's never been this strong before," he muttered. We rushed to the window. Outside, the world had taken on a surreal quality. A thick mist was rolling down from the mountain, enveloping the town in its ghostly embrace. And in that mist, shadows moved. Vague, indistinct shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "My God," Zoe breathed. "It's coming for us." As we watched in horror, the mist continued to advance, bringing with it an otherworldly silence that smothered the usual sounds of the night. The pulsing grew louder, reverberating through our bodies, seeming to pull at something deep within us. Officer Reeves snapped into action. "We need to evacuate the town, now." But even as he spoke, I knew it was too late. The mist had already cut us off, isolating us from the rest of the world. Whatever was coming, we would have to face it alone. I turned to my friends, seeing my own fear and determination mirrored in their eyes. "We started this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Now we have to finish it." As one, we turned back to the window. The mist pressed against the glass, and in its swirling depths, faces began to form, ancient, hungry faces that watched us with inhuman patience. The heart of the mountain was awake, and it was calling us home. The world outside had become a nightmare landscape, shrouded in mist and filled with half-glimpsed horrors. Officer Reeves was on his radio, desperately trying to coordinate some kind of response, but it was clear that we were on our own. "We need to get to the mountain," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Whatever's causing this, the source is up there." Noah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane? We barely made it out alive last time." "James is right," Zoe interjected, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We started this. We have to end it." Officer Reeves finished his call and turned to us, his face grim. "Backup's on the way, but it'll take time to get through that mist. If you kids think you can do something to stop this, I'll cover you." We gathered what supplies we could: flashlights, rope, and the mysterious book that had started it all. As we stepped out into the mist-shrouded street, the pulsing rhythm seemed to intensify, vibrating through the very air around us. Our progress was slow and terrifying. The mist played tricks on our eyes, conjuring shapes that vanished when we looked directly at them. More than once, I caught glimpses of familiar faces in the swirling vapor. Neighbors, friends, all wearing expressions of abject terror. As we neared the base of the mountain, a figure emerged from the mist. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was the old woman I'd encountered before. But as it drew closer, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was Duke, or what Duke had become. The St. Bernard's normally gentle eyes now glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. His fur was matted and damp, and there was something wrong with the way he moved, as if his bones had been rearranged. Noah let out a choked sob. "Duke? Boy, is that you?" The thing that had been Duke turned its gaze on us, and I saw a flicker of recognition in those glowing eyes. For a moment, hope surged in my chest. Then, with a sound that was half growl, half human moan, it lunged at us. Officer Reeves reacted instantly, pushing Noah out of the way and grappling with the monstrous dog. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold it off. Get to the cave." We ran, the sounds of the struggle fading behind us as we plunged into the mist-shrouded forest. The familiar trail was almost unrecognizable, twisted by the supernatural fog into something alien and threatening. As we climbed higher, the mist began to thin, revealing a sky that churned with unnatural colors. The pulsing had become a physical force, each beat threatening to drive us to our knees. Finally, we reached the clearing with the cave. The ancient door stood open, darkness spilling out like a living thing. Without a word, we stepped into the mountain's maw. The passageway seemed to have changed since our last visit. The walls pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence, revealing twisting patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of decay and something older, more primeval. As we descended deeper into the heart of the mountain, voices began to whisper from the walls, snatches of conversation in languages long dead, screams of terror and ecstasy, laughter that bordered on madness. When we finally emerged into the central chamber, I barely recognized it. The altar at its center now pulsed with dark energy, tendrils of shadow writhing around it. The skeleton was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of mist and darkness. And there, standing before the altar, was a figure I recognized from Margarito's book, tall, inhuman, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with the fire of dying stars. "Welcome, children," it said, its voice resonating in our minds rather than our ears. "You have done well to come this far." "What are you?" Zoe demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The being's mouth stretched into something approximating a smile. "I am the heart of the mountain, the guardian of secrets, the bridge between worlds. And you, my dear, are the key to unleashing my full power upon this realm." With a gesture, the creature sent tendrils of darkness snaking towards us. I clutched Margarito's book to my chest, feeling it pulse with a power of its own. "The book," Noah gasped. "James, use the book." Instinctively, I opened it, the pages flipping of their own accord. Words in an unknown language spilled from my lips, and a blinding light erupted from the tome. The heart of the mountain shrieked, a sound that threatened to shatter our sanity. The chamber began to shake, rocks falling from the ceiling as the very mountain seemed to tear itself apart. "We have to get out of here," I shouted over the din. We ran, the tunnel collapsing behind us as we fled. The journey back to the surface was a blur of terror and adrenaline. When we finally burst out into the open air, we were met with a scene of chaos. The mist was dissipating, revealing a town in turmoil. People wandered the streets in confusion, as if waking from a shared nightmare. In the distance, we could hear the wail of approaching sirens. As we stood there, gasping for breath, I became aware of a weight in my hand. Looking down, I saw that Margarito's book had crumbled to dust, leaving behind a single page covered in flowing script. "It's over," Zoe said, her voice filled with relief and exhaustion. But even as she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The heart of the mountain had been defeated, but at what cost? And what other secrets lay buried in the dark places of the world, waiting to be awakened? In the days and weeks that followed, life in our small town struggled to return to normal. The official story, as reported by the local news and repeated by shell-shocked residents, was that a combination of unusual weather patterns and a gas leak from an old mining operation had caused mass hallucinations and temporary hysteria. But for those of us who knew the truth, nothing would ever be the same. Officer Reeves, who had survived his encounter with the transformed Duke, became an unlikely ally. He used his position to help contain the more fantastic elements of what had happened, while quietly investigating similar occurrences in other parts of the country. Duke himself was found wandering in the woods 3 days after the incident, confused but otherwise unharmed. Noah's family was overjoyed at his return, but Noah couldn't shake the memory of what his beloved pet had become in those dark hours. Zoe threw herself into research with renewed vigor, determined to understand the forces we had encountered. She began corresponding with scholars and occultists around the world, piecing together a bigger picture that was both fascinating and terrifying. As for me, I found myself haunted by dreams of the heart of the mountain. In the quiet hours of the night, I could still hear its whispers, feel the pull of its otherworldly power. The single remaining page from Margarito's book became my most prized possession, a reminder of what we had faced and a warning of what might still be out there. Our experiences had forged an unbreakable bond between us. We met often, sometimes to discuss our ongoing investigations, but more often just to reassure ourselves that we weren't alone in carrying the weight of what we knew. One crisp autumn evening, almost a year to the day after our first fateful hike up Mount Blackridge, we gathered at our usual spot in the Roasted Bean. As we sipped our coffee and chatted about mundane things, I found my gaze drawn to the mountain looming in the distance. "Do you ever think about going back up there?" I asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Noah and Zoe followed my gaze, their expressions a mix of fear and longing. "Sometimes," Zoe admitted. "There's still so much we don't understand." Noah shook his head. "I don't know if I could. The memories, they're still too fresh." I nodded, understanding both perspectives. Part of me never wanted to set foot on that mountain again. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to its mysteries, whispered that our journey was far from over. As if sensing my thoughts, Zoe reached out and squeezed my hand. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "we face it together." Noah nodded in agreement, and I felt a surge of gratitude for these friends who had stood by me through the unimaginable. The crisp autumn air nipped at my exposed skin as I stepped out of my house on that fateful Friday evening. It was September 15th, 2017, and at 17 years old, I felt invincible. The world was my playground, and these woods, these glorious, untamed stretches of nature, were my personal kingdom. My name is Olivia, and I've lived on the outskirts of this small English town my entire life. Our quiet suburban neighborhood nestled at the edge of Whispering Woods, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed forest that loomed beyond us. For as long as I can remember, the woods had been calling to me, their siren song of adventure and mystery impossible to resist. As I clipped the leash onto my loyal companion, a spirited border collie named Pepper, I felt the familiar excitement bubbling up inside me. Our evening walks had become a cherished ritual, a way to unwind after the stress of school and lose myself in the beauty of nature. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. I checked my watch. 6:07 p.m. Perfect timing. I knew from experience that the woods would be practically deserted at this hour on a Friday evening, which was precisely why I had chosen this time for our walks. With a spring in my step and Pepper trotting happily beside me, we set off towards the woods. The familiar path stretched out before us, winding its way through the neighborhood before plunging into the embrace of the forest. As we walked, I pulled out my iPod and scrolled through my playlists. The gentle rustling of leaves and Pepper's excited panting faded away as I slipped my headphones on, letting the music wash over me. The world narrowed down to the rhythm of my footsteps, the beat of the music, and the sight of the path ahead. We passed the last houses of the neighborhood, their warm lights a final reminder of civilization before we entered the realm of nature. The trees loomed ahead, their branches reaching out like welcoming arms. I had walked this path hundreds of times before, in all seasons and all weathers. It was as familiar to me as the back of my hand. Or so I thought. As we entered the woods, the fading sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the ground. Pepper's tail wagged furiously as he caught the scent of small animals in the underbrush. Everything was as it should be, peaceful and serene. We continued deeper into the woods, following the well-worn path that meandered through the trees. I hummed along to my music, my mind wandering to thoughts of the weekend ahead. There was a big history test on Monday that I needed to study for, and I was mulling over the best way to approach it. About 15 minutes into our walk, we reached the field that marked the halfway point of our usual route. It was a beautiful spot, a gentle slope leading down into a small valley. Wildflowers dotted the grass, adding splashes of color to the green expanse. On a normal day, I would pause here for a moment, drinking in the view and letting Pepper run free for a bit. But this was not a normal day. As we began our descent into the valley, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It started as a vague sense of unease, a prickling at the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being silly. After all, this was my woods, my safe place. What could possibly be wrong? But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. The music that had been so comforting just moments ago now felt intrusive, disconnecting me from my surroundings in a way that suddenly seemed dangerous. With trembling hands, I pulled out my headphones and switched off my iPod, stuffing them into my pocket. The silence of the woods rushed in, broken only by the sound of my quickening breath and the rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. Pepper, picking up on my unease, had gone unnaturally quiet, his ears pricked forward and alert. I quickened my pace, my walk turning into a half jog as we reached the bottom of the field. Pepper, sensing my urgency, had taken off ahead of me, disappearing into the tree line at the edge of the field. As I approached the fence that marked the boundary between the field and the wooded path beyond, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, its frantic rhythm seeming to echo through the unnaturally quiet woods. With shaking hands, I squeezed through the familiar hole in the fence, emerging onto the dirt path surrounded by towering trees. I took the usual right turn, my feet moving almost of their own accord along the well-trodden route. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back to the safety of home and civilization. But a small, rational part of my mind held me back. I was probably just letting my imagination run wild, I told myself. There was no reason to panic. Oh, how wrong I was. As I continued along the path, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin despite the cool evening air. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were boring into me from every direction, hidden among the shadows of the trees. Unable to resist the urge any longer, I slowly turned my head to look behind me. At first I saw nothing but the empty path stretching back the way I had come, bordered by the silent, looming trees. Relief began to wash over me, and I almost laughed at my own paranoia. Then I saw it. Just for a split second, barely long enough to register, a dark shape moved behind one of the trees. It was gone so quickly that I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, my heart now pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting frantically from side to side, searching the deepening shadows for any sign of movement. Pepper was nowhere to be seen, having run ahead in his excitement. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone in these woods that I had always considered a second home. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before me, each bend and turn revealing only more trees, more shadows, more places for unseen watchers to hide. The silence of the forest was oppressive now, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I don't know what made me turn around again. Perhaps it was some primal instinct, a vestigial alarm system buried deep in our DNA, warning us of predators stalking from behind. Whatever the reason, I found myself spinning around once more, my eyes wide with fear. And there it was. The sight that greeted me was so terrifying, so utterly wrong, that for a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Standing in the middle of the path, perhaps 20 meters behind me, was a figure. But to call it a figure seems inadequate, fails to capture the otherworldly wrongness of what I saw. It was shaped like a man, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its entire form was pitch black, not the black of shadows or clothing, but a deep, unnatural void that seemed to drink in what little light remained in the forest. It stood unnaturally still, its arms hanging straight down at its sides, fists clenched. But it was the face, or rather the lack of a face, that truly chilled me to my core. Where there should have been features, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of that same impossible blackness. Yet somehow, impossibly, I could feel it staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A sound escaped my throat, a strangled whimper that seemed to hang in the air between us. The thing's head tilted slightly, an eerily human gesture that only served to heighten its alien nature. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The forest around us faded away, and there was only me and this impossible, terrifying entity. I could feel the weight of its gaze upon me, filled with a malevolence that defied description. Then, as if a spell had been broken, I found myself able to move again. Without conscious thought, my body took over, survival instinct kicking in. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt path, my lungs burning as I gulped in great gasps of air. I ran as I had never run before, branches whipping at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush. The path was forgotten now. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. As I ran, I became aware of a sound behind me. Not footsteps, but a strange rushing noise, like wind through leaves but somehow wrong, distorted. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the blind panic of flight. My world narrowed down to the pounding of my heart, the burning in my lungs, and the terrible certainty that if I slowed down for even a moment, that thing would be upon me. Finally, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and into the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The warm glow of streetlights and the distant sounds of traffic had never been so welcome. I staggered to a stop, bent double, hands on my knees as I fought to catch my breath. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. My legs gave out and I sank to the ground, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down my face as great, heaving sobs racked my frame. It was there, curled up on the sidewalk of my quiet suburban street, that the true horror of what I had experienced began to sink in. The woods that had been my sanctuary, my place of peace and adventure, had been irreversibly tainted. And lurking in the back of my mind was the terrifying question: what if it followed me home? The days that followed my encounter in the woods were a blur of fear, sleepless nights, and a growing sense of paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing from the woods had somehow followed me back to the safety of civilization. My parents, concerned by my sudden change in behavior, tried to get me to open up about what was wrong. But how could I explain what I had seen? The words seemed inadequate, unable to capture the sheer otherworldly terror of that faceless figure. And deep down, I feared they wouldn't believe me, that they'd dismiss it as an overactive imagination, or worse, a sign of mental instability. So I kept silent, forcing smiles and making excuses about being stressed over schoolwork. But inside, I was falling apart. Sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that featureless black face, felt the weight of its malevolent gaze. I would jerk awake in a cold sweat, convinced that if I opened my eyes, I would find it standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with its non-existent eyes. During the day, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. The woods that had once been my refuge now loomed on the edge of town like a malevolent presence, a constant reminder of the horror that lurked within. It was on the third sleepless night that I first noticed the scratching. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the wall behind my bed. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the house settling, or perhaps a tree branch scraping against the siding. But as I lay there, rigid with fear, the sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Scratch. 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 With trembling hands, I reached for my bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The scratching stopped immediately, leaving behind a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, the light on, straining my ears for any hint of that awful sound. The next morning, dark circles under my eyes and nerves frayed to the breaking point, I finally broke down and confided in my best friend, Mia. We met at our favorite cafe, a cozy little place called the Rustic Bean, just a few blocks from the edge of the woods. As I recounted my experience, I watched Mia's expression change from concern to disbelief to outright fear. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "Olivia," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "have you ever heard of the Whispering Woods Wraith?" I shook my head, a chill running down my spine at the name. Mia leaned in closer, her eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "It's an old legend around here. They say that back in the 1800s, a man was wrongfully executed for a crime he didn't commit. With his dying breath, he cursed the town and vowed to haunt the woods for eternity." I felt the blood drain from my face as Mia continued. "The story goes that his spirit still roams the forest, appearing to travelers as a shadow figure. They say if you see him, he'll follow you home, trying to claim your soul as revenge for his unjust death." The scratching, the thing I had seen, with its humanoid silhouette. It all fit together in a horrifying pattern that made my head spin. "But it's just a story, right?" I asked, hating how small and frightened my voice sounded. Mia shrugged, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "I don't know, Olivia. I always thought so, but after what you've told me..." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the legend and my experience pressing down on us. Finally, Mia spoke again, her voice filled with determination. "We need to find out more about this. If there's any truth to the legend, maybe we can find a way to protect you." And so began our investigation into the dark history of Whispering Woods and the entity that haunted its depths. Little did we know, our search for answers would lead us down a path darker and more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. The next few weeks were a blur of research and mounting dread. Mia and I spent every spare moment poring over old town records, newspaper archives, and local history books. The more we uncovered, the more unsettling the story became. We learned that the executed man had a name: Thomas Aldridge. He had been accused of murdering 3 young women in the woods back in 1873. The evidence against him had been circumstantial at best, but in the grip of fear and hysteria, the town had demanded swift justice. One dusty old newspaper article described Aldridge's final moments. As the noose was placed around his neck, Aldridge's eyes blazed with an unholy fire. "I curse you all," he cried, his voice ringing out across the assembled crowd. "I'll haunt these woods for eternity, and my vengeance will fall upon the innocent, just as your so-called justice has fallen upon me." With these chilling words, the trapdoor opened, and Aldridge dropped to his death. The article went on to describe a series of strange occurrences in the weeks following the execution. Livestock went missing, crops withered overnight, and several townspeople reported seeing a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the woods. But it was an entry in the diary of the town's minister that truly chilled us to the bone. October 17th, 1873, I fear that Aldridge's curse was more than the ravings of a condemned man. Last night, as I sat by my fire, I heard a terrible scratching at my wall. When I went to investigate, I saw a figure standing in my garden, A figure of absolute darkness, featureless and terrifying. It turned its blank face towards me, and I felt a malevolence that shook me to my very soul. God help us all. As I read these words, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The scratching, the featureless face, it all matched what I had experienced. This thing, this whispering woods wraith, had been terrorizing our town for over a century. But why had it fixated on me? And more importantly, how could I stop it? Our research took a more esoteric turn as we delved into books on local folklore and supernatural legends. We learned of protective symbols, salt circles, and iron talismans said to ward off evil spirits. Desperate for any form of defense, I began carrying a small iron nail in my pocket and lined my windowsill with salt. Whether it was the protective measures or simply coincidence, the scratching at my wall stopped. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought perhaps it was over, that the entity had moved on. Then came the dreams. They started innocuously enough, vague nightmares of being lost in the woods, of shadows moving just out of sight. But as the nights wore on, they grew more vivid, more terrifying. I found myself back in those woods, running from something I couldn't see, the sound of rhythmic scratching growing louder and louder until it filled my entire world. I would wake up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat, the echo of that terrible scratching still ringing in my ears. Even in the light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dreams were more than just products of my traumatized mind. They felt real, as if the entity was reaching out to me across the barrier of sleep. Mia, ever the pragmatist, suggested we seek out someone with more knowledge of the supernatural. There's this old woman who lives on the edge of town, she told me one day as we sat in the rustic bean, surrounded by our growing pile of research. People say she's a bit odd, but they also say she knows things about the woods that no one else does. I was skeptical, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. And so, on a gray Saturday afternoon, Mia and I found ourselves standing on the porch of a small, weathered cottage at the very edge of town, mere yards from where the streets gave way to the looming trees of Whispering Woods. The woman who answered our knock was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes cloudy with cataracts. But there was a sharpness to her gaze that belied her frail appearance. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice creaking like old timber. "Come in, children. We have much to discuss." The interior of the cottage was cluttered with an eclectic mix of odds and ends, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with old books and strange artifacts, and in the center of it all, a large wooden table covered in what looked like star charts and arcane symbols. "My name is Agnes," the old woman said as she gestured for us to sit. "And you, my dear," she said, fixing me with her milky gaze, "have attracted the attention of something very old and very dangerous." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. "You know about the entity in the woods?" I asked. Agnes nodded solemnly. "The Whispering Woods Wraith, yes. It's been a part of this town's history for longer than most realize. Thomas Aldrich may have given it form and purpose, but the entity itself, it's far older than that." She went on to explain that the woods had always been a place of power, a thin spot between our world and something else. The entity, she said, was a manifestation of that otherworldly energy, given shape and direction by Aldrich's dying curse. "But why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why has it focused on me?" Agnes's cloudy eyes seemed to look right through me. "Some people are more sensitive to the otherworldly, my dear. You've always felt a connection to those woods, haven't you? That connection goes both ways. You've opened a door, and now the entity is trying to pull you through it." The implications of her words were terrifying. This wasn't just about being haunted or stalked. The entity was trying to claim me, to drag me into whatever dark realm it inhabited. "Is there any way to stop it?" Mia asked, her face pale with fear for me. Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled hands tracing patterns on the table before her. "There might be," she said finally. but it won't be easy, and it will be dangerous. She explained that to banish the entity, we would need to perform a ritual at the site of Aldridge's execution, the old oak tree at the crossroads deep in the heart of Whispering Woods. The ritual would need to be performed at midnight on the anniversary of Aldridge's death, using a mixture of sacred herbs and our own blood. But be warned, Agnes said, her voice grave. The entity will fight back. It won't give up its claim easily, and if the ritual fails... She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Failure would mean more than just death. It would mean my soul being claimed by the Wraith for eternity. As Mia and I left Agnes's cottage, our heads spinning with this new information, I felt a mix of hope and terror. We had a potential solution, but the price of failure was unthinkable. And we had less than a week until the anniversary of Aldridge's execution. The race against time had begun, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation and mounting dread. Mia and I threw ourselves into gathering the components for the ritual, following Agnes's precise instructions. We collected sprigs of rosemary for protection, sage for purification, and a rare herb called Devil's Shoestring that Agnes swore would bind the entity. Each night, my dreams grew more intense. I would find myself running through endless dark woods, the scratching sound all around me, closing in. More than once, I woke up to find actual scratch marks on my arms or legs, as if the entity was trying to claim me even in my sleep. The night before the ritual, I lay awake in my bed, too terrified to close my eyes. The scratching had returned, louder than ever, seeming to come from all around me. As I huddled under my blankets, I heard a new sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "You're mine," it hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You've always been mine. Tomorrow night I'll claim what's rightfully mine." I must have screamed, because the next thing I knew, my parents were bursting into my room, their faces etched with worry. I broke down then, the stress and fear of the past weeks finally overwhelming me. Through my tears, I told them everything. The encounter in the woods, the dreams, the scratching, all of it. To my surprise and immense relief, they believed me. My mother held me as I cried, while my father's face grew grim with determination. "We'll face this together," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Whatever it takes, we'll protect you." The next morning, Mia arrived early, her face pale but resolute. When I told her about my parents' reaction and their insistence on accompanying us, she nodded in relief. "The more people we have for the ritual, the stronger it will be," she said. Agnes told me that the entity feeds on isolation and fear. Having your parents there, showing love and support, it might give us the edge we need. As the day wore on, tension built like an approaching storm. We went over the ritual again and again, memorizing every word, every gesture. My mother prepared a hearty meal, insisting we keep our strength up, but none of us had much appetite. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our quiet street, we made our final preparations. Holy water blessed by the local priest, iron nails, sachets of protective herbs. We armed ourselves as best we could against the supernatural threat we were about to face. Just before we left, I went to my room one last time. As I stood there, looking at the familiar space that had become a place of terror over the past weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened tonight, it would be an end to the fear and uncertainty that had plagued me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Then I turned and walked out of my room, ready to face the entity that had haunted my days and nights. As our small group set out towards Whispering Woods, the last light of day fading from the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the belly of the beast. The woods loomed before us, darker and more forbidding than I had ever seen them. With each step towards those shadowy depths, the scratching in my mind grew louder, more insistent. The entity knew we were coming. It was waiting for us. And as we passed the first line of trees plunging into the darkness of whispering woods, I heard that terrible whisper once more. "Welcome home, my dear. I've been waiting for you." The forest seemed to close in around us as we made our way deeper into whispering woods. The familiar paths I had walked countless times now felt alien and threatening. Shadows danced at the edge of our flashlight beams, and more than once I could have sworn I saw a dark figure flitting between the trees. The scratching sound was constant now, a maddening rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I could see the strain on everyone's faces as they heard it too, confirming that this was no figment of my imagination. As we neared the crossroads where the old oak stood, the air grew thick and heavy, as if we were wading through invisible syrup. Each step became a struggle, and I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on my mind, urging me to turn back, to give up, to submit to the entity's will. But the warm presence of my parents on either side of me, and Mia's determined face just ahead, gave me the strength to push on. We had come too far to turn back now. Finally, we reached the crossroads. The old oak tree loomed before us, its gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers against the starless sky. At its base, barely visible in the gloom, was a weathered stone marker, the site of Thomas Aldridge's execution over a century ago. As we approached the tree, a wind whipped up from nowhere, howling through the branches and nearly extinguishing our flashlights. In that moment of near darkness, I saw it. The entity, standing at the edge of the clearing, its featureless face turned towards us. "Now!" Mia shouted over the wind. "We have to start now!" With shaking hands, we began to set up for the ritual. My father drove iron nails into the ground at the 4 cardinal points around the oak, while my mother and Mia laid out a circle of salt. I stood at the center, clutching the bundle of herbs Agnes had prepared, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As the clock on Mia's phone ticked over to midnight, we began the ritual. Our voices rose in unison, reciting the words Agnes had taught us, an ancient incantation in a language none of us understood. As we chanted, I felt a change in the air, a building of power that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The entity began to move, gliding towards us with unnatural speed. But as it reached the edge of our circle, it recoiled as if it had hit an invisible wall. A horrible screech filled the air, a sound of rage and frustration that shook me to my core. We continued the chant, our voices growing stronger as we saw the effect it was having. The entity writhed and twisted, its form becoming less distinct, as if it was being pulled apart by invisible forces. But then, just as I thought we might succeed, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind blew across the clearing, breaking our salt circle. In an instant, the entity was upon us. My father was thrown back against the oak tree with a sickening crack. My mother screamed, rushing to his side. Mia was knocked to the ground, the breath driven from her lungs. And I found myself face to face with the entity, its featureless visage inches from my own. I could feel its cold, otherworldly presence seeping into me, trying to claim my very soul. In that moment of terror, a memory flashed through my mind. Agnes's words about the entity feeding on fear and isolation. With the last of my strength, I reached out, grasping my mother's hand on one side and Mia's on the other. "Together!" I shouted. "We have to finish it together!" Our voices rose once more, ragged but determined. I felt a surge of warmth flow through me, the love of my family and friends pushing back against the entity's cold touch. The chant reached its crescendo, and suddenly the clearing was filled with a blinding light. The entity let out a final, terrible shriek, and then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a faint echo of that maddening scratching sound. As the light faded and our eyes adjusted to the darkness, I looked around in disbelief. We were all still there, battered and shaken, but alive. My father groaned as he sat up, bruised but not seriously hurt. For a long moment, we all sat in stunned silence, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we fell into each other's arms, laughing and crying with relief. As we made our way out of the woods, supporting each other and marveling at our survival, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The oppressive presence that had haunted me for weeks was gone, banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. But as we reached the edge of the woods, I couldn't help but cast one last look back into the darkness. The entity was gone, yes, but the woods still held their secrets. And somewhere in those shadowy depths, I knew other mysteries and dangers lurked, waiting to be discovered. Our ordeal was over, but I had a feeling that my adventures in Whispering Woods were far from finished. The days following our confrontation with the entity in Whispering Woods passed in a blur of exhaustion and lingering fear. Despite our victory, the experience had left its mark on all of us. My father's back was a tapestry of bruises from his impact with the oak tree, and we all jumped at unexpected noises, our nerves still raw from the encounter. But slowly, gradually, a sense of normalcy began to return. The scratching that had plagued my nights was gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of our quiet suburb. My dreams, while still occasionally unsettling, no longer featured the terrifying chase through endless dark woods. A week after the ritual, we gathered at the Rustic Bean, my parents, Mia, and myself, to discuss what had happened and what it meant for our future. The cafe felt almost surreally normal after what we'd been through. The cheerful chatter of other patrons and the rich aroma of coffee, a stark contrast to the otherworldly terror we'd faced. "I've been doing some more research," Mia said, her voice low as she leaned across the table. "What happened to us? It's not an isolated incident. There are stories from all over the world of similar entities, of places where the barrier between our world and something else is thin." My father nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. About why these things seem to happen here in Whispering Woods. It's always been a special place," I mused, thinking back to how I'd always felt drawn to the woods, even as a child. Maybe that's why. Maybe some places are just more connected to the other side. Whatever the reason, my mother interjected, her hand finding mine under the table. "We need to be prepared. If it happened once, it could happen again." She was right, of course. Our encounter with the entity had opened our eyes to a world hidden just beneath the surface of our ordinary lives. A world of ancient powers, of dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. "So, what do we do?" I asked, looking around at the faces of my family and my best friend. "Do we just go back to normal? Pretend none of this ever happened?" Mia shook her head emphatically. "No, we can't just ignore it. But we can be prepared. We can learn more, understand more. Maybe we can even help if something like this happens again." And so, in the weeks and months that followed, we began to educate ourselves. We pored over books on folklore and the occult, separating fact from fiction as best we could. We learned about protective measures, about the signs that might indicate supernatural activity. We also reached out to others who had experienced similar phenomena. Through online forums and carefully worded inquiries, we connected with a network of people who had faced the unknown and lived to tell the tale. Their stories were both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because we knew we weren't alone. Terrifying because of the dangers they described. As for Whispering Woods itself, I couldn't stay away for long. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, I felt drawn back to those familiar paths. But now, I went prepared. Iron nails in my pocket, protective herbs sewn into the lining of my jacket, and most importantly, an awareness of the true nature of the woods. Mia often accompanied me on these expeditions, her notebook filled with observations and sketches. We mapped out areas where we felt that strange otherworldly energy, marking them for future investigation. And though we never again encountered anything as terrifying as the entity, we often felt the weight of unseen eyes upon us, reminding us that the woods still held their secrets. One crisp autumn evening, almost a year to the day after our original encounter, Mia and I stood at the edge of Whispering Woods. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. We had come to reflect on our experiences and to check on the protective wards we had placed around the old oak tree. As we walked the now familiar path, I felt a mix of emotions: respect for the power of the woods, lingering fear from our ordeal, but also a sense of purpose. We had faced the unknown and survived, and in doing so, had taken on a responsibility to protect others from similar dangers. We reached the crossroads just as twilight was settling in. The old oak stood as it always had, but now it felt less menacing, more like a silent sentinel guarding the boundary between worlds. We checked the wards, iron nails still firmly in place, protective symbols carved into the bark still clear and strong. As we turned to leave, a cool breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it a whisper of that once terrifying scratching sound. But this time, it felt less like a threat and more like a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown, and of our role in maintaining that balance. We walked back in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The woods around us teemed with life and secrets, but we were no longer afraid. We had found our place in this liminal world, guardians of the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary. As we emerged from the tree line, the lights of our town twinkling in the distance, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Whatever challenges the future might hold, whatever mysteries Whispering Woods might yet reveal, we would face them together, older, wiser, and unafraid of the darkness. The morning air bit at my exposed skin as I shouldered my backpack outside the small pensione in Fornovelasco, a tiny village nestled in the Apuan Alps of northern Tuscany. At 32, I had been planning this solo hiking expedition for months, carefully mapping routes through some of Italy's most remote mountain trails. The weather forecast promised clear skies, but something about the heavy clouds lingering over Monteferrato's distinctive stone arch made me pause. I checked my equipment one final time: topographical maps, compass, emergency supplies, and enough water for a full day's hiking. The elderly proprietor of the pension had warned me about hiking alone, especially in autumn when sudden weather changes could trap the unprepared. But I had years of experience and confidence in my abilities. The first hour passed uneventfully as I followed the well-marked trail, watching the morning mist slowly dissipate around the limestone peaks. The path wound through old-growth beech forests, their leaves turning golden and russet in the autumn chill. The only sounds were my boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. As I gained elevation, the forest began to thin, revealing glimpses of the coastline far below. The natural arch of Monteferrato loomed ahead, a massive window carved by millennia of erosion into the mountain's face. But something felt off about the morning. The birds had gone quiet, and the wind carried an unsettling metallic taste. That's when I encountered the couple. They appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a man and woman in their 50s, both wearing expensive hiking gear that seemed incongruous with their distressed state. The woman's face was drawn with concern, but it was the man who caught my attention. His skin had a ghastly pallor, and his hands trembled violently at his sides. I stepped aside to let them pass, offering a casual "buongiorno." But the man stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, his hand shot out and gripped my shoulder. His fingers dug into my flesh with desperate strength. The man's eyes were wide, the pupils contracted to pinpoints despite the dim morning light. His mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak in rapid Italian, his voice raw with emotion. I caught only fragments: something about impossible and returning, but the rest was lost to my limited grasp of the language. His wife moved quickly to his side, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. She looked at me apologetically and said in halting English, "Please, forgive. You look exactly like..." She paused, struggling for words. Someone he knew. Someone who died here. 20 years ago. She pulled him away, practically dragging him down the trail. I watched them disappear around the bend, the man's ragged breathing audible long after they vanished from sight. The encounter left me shaken, not just by the man's bizarre behavior, but by the absolute conviction in his eyes. He had looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost, and in that moment, I had felt like one. As if I were somehow less substantial, less real than I had been moments before. I considered turning back, but the thought seemed ridiculous in the growing daylight. Instead, I pressed on, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. Yet as I climbed higher, I couldn't escape the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the morning air, as if reality had developed a hairline crack through which something else was beginning to seep. The incident with the couple marked the beginning of what would become the most harrowing day of my life. As I continued climbing, the well-marked trail gradually became less distinct. I consulted my map frequently, but the terrain didn't quite match what was marked. Subtle discrepancies at first, then more significant ones. By early afternoon, I had to admit I had somehow strayed from the main route. The limestone outcroppings that should have led to Monteferrato's arch had given way to a different type of terrain entirely. I found myself in a narrow valley, following a stream that cut through the rock like a wound. The water ran crystal clear over smooth stones, but something about its sound seemed wrong, too hollow, as if it were echoing from much further away than it should have been. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the sun, when visible through the trees, seemed dimmer than it should have been at that hour. I checked my phone's GPS, but the signal was non-existent. The paper map showed several possible routes back to marked trails, but as I studied it, I realized with growing unease that the landscape around me didn't match any of them. The stream I was following shouldn't have existed according to the topographical lines. The stream I had been following eventually led to a steep rock ravine. The walls rose sharply on either side, water-worn limestone creating patterns that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. As I pressed forward, the ravine deepened until it suddenly terminated in a massive sinkhole, a dark maw in the earth at least 30 feet across. The water disappeared into its depths with a sound like distant laughter. Standing at its edge, I felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with height. The hole seemed to pulse with its own gravity, as if it might draw in more than just water. I backed away carefully, my boots scraping against loose stones. The only option was to climb to higher ground and find another route. The slope was treacherous, loose scree sliding under every step. My hands were soon raw from grabbing at sharp rock edges. As I crested the ridge, I saw it. A shepherd's hut standing in stark silhouette against the increasingly threatening sky. The structure was old, perhaps centuries old, built from local stone with a partially collapsed roof of traditional red tiles. A single window gaped like an empty eye socket, its wooden frame long since rotted away. The doorway held only splinters where a door had once been. I needed to check my map and catch my breath. The hut, despite its decrepit state, offered the first sign of human presence I'd seen in hours. I dropped my backpack by the wall and pulled out my map, trying to reconcile my position with the terrain I'd covered. The first sound was so subtle I almost missed it, the whisper of loose tiles shifting inside the hut. I froze, map trembling slightly in my hands. Another sound followed, clearer this time. The distinct crunch of ceramic fragments underweight. Something was moving inside. My rational mind supplied possibilities. A bird, a small animal seeking shelter. But there was something deliberate about the movement, a rhythm that seemed almost human. I stepped away from the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I found myself moving toward the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The interior was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the remnants of ancient wooden beams, fragments of broken pottery, and in the far corner, a mountain goat stood motionless, its eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the gloom. For a moment, relief flooded through me. Then I noticed something wrong about its posture, about the way it held itself. It seemed too tall, too straight, almost as if... The goat bolted, disappearing through the collapsed section of the back wall. I hurried around the building, curious despite my unease. The rear of the hut opened onto a steep V-shaped valley, its sides rising at an almost impossible angle. And there, moving with impossible speed up the nearly vertical slope, was a figure that my mind wouldn't, process properly. In that moment of confused perception, I saw what appeared to be a man running upright, but with the powerful haunches of a goat, crowned with curved horns that caught the dying sunlight. Then my vision shifted, reality reasserting itself, and I understood. The steep angle of the slope had created an optical illusion, making the goat's four-legged scramble appear bipedal. But the damage was done. I understood in that moment how ancient people, catching similar glimpses in these remote mountains, had created their legends of fauns and satyrs. Standing there, with the wind rising and darkness gathering in the valleys below, those legends didn't seem quite so far-fetched anymore. The encounter with the goat should have been the end of it. A moment of misperception explained away by rational thought. But as I stood there watching the valley where the animal had disappeared, something began to change in the quality of the light. The sun hadn't set, but it seemed to dim, as if a filter had been drawn across the sky. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that might have been distant bells, or might have been something else entirely. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath began to fog in front of my face. I needed to find my way back to marked trails before dark. My map showed several possibilities, but none of them quite matched what I was seeing. The mountains themselves seemed to have shifted, presenting faces and angles that shouldn't have been possible from my position. As I gathered my gear, I heard it. A sound from inside the hut again. This time it wasn't the crunch of tiles. It was a voice, speaking in what might have been ancient Italian or Latin or something older still. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakably human, unmistakably close. I spun around, but the hut stood empty, its broken windows staring blankly. The voice came again, this time from the valley behind me. When I turned, there was nothing but wind-blown scrub and loose stones. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, as if the mountains themselves were speaking. The decision to leave the shepherd's hut came too late. I had spent precious daylight trying to orient myself, and now the light was failing faster than it should have. The clouds had thickened into a solid mass overhead, turning the afternoon prematurely dark. The wind had picked up considerably, carrying with it the first stinging drops of rain. My map, already degrading from constant handling with sweaty hands, began to tear at the creases. I folded it carefully into my jacket pocket, knowing I needed to move quickly. There were two possible routes down, following the V-shaped valley where I'd seen the goat, or backtracking toward the sinkhole to find another path. Neither option seemed particularly safe. I chose the valley, reasoning that water always flows downhill, and settlements tend to be in valleys. The descent began easily enough, but the terrain quickly became treacherous. The slope was covered in loose scree that shifted underfoot, sending small avalanches of stones clattering into the growing darkness below. The rain intensified, turning from scattered drops to a steady drizzle. The limestone became treacherously slick, forcing me to move with agonizing slowness. Each step had to be tested, each handhold verified. The failing light played tricks with depth perception, making it impossible to judge distances accurately. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere above me, a sound that could have been human, or could have been the wind twisting through the rocks. But there was something in its pitch that made my skin crawl, something that spoke to primitive parts of my brain. It came again, closer this time, and I pressed myself against the wet rock face, trying to become part of the stone. The screams continued, moving in a circle around my position, sometimes seeming to come from directly overhead, sometimes from the depths below. I knew mountain lions weren't native to this part of Italy. These sounds couldn't be animal, but they couldn't be human either. They had a quality that defied categorization, as if they were coming from somewhere between states of being. I continued my descent, moving faster now despite the danger. The need to get down overwhelmed my caution. My boots slipped on the wet stone, and I fell. The world spun around me as I slid down the scree slope, desperately trying to arrest my fall. My hands were torn raw on the sharp rocks before I managed to stop myself, feet dangling over a drop I couldn't see the bottom of. The screams had stopped, replaced by something worse. The sound of movement on the slope above me. Slow, deliberate movement. Something was picking its way down the same path I had taken. Something heavy. I didn't wait to see what was following me. Using my last reserves of strength, I pulled myself away from the edge and continued down the slope, no longer trying to be quiet. Rocks clattered down around me, echoing off unseen walls. The rain had soaked through my jacket, and my whole body shook with cold and adrenaline. The slope gradually began to level out, and I found myself in a narrow valley bottom. The walls rose straight up on either side, disappearing into the low clouds. There was just enough light left to make out a path of sorts. Not man-made, but a natural depression that wound between the rock walls. I followed it, having no better option. The sound of running water grew louder, but it wasn't the same stream I had followed earlier. This sound was deeper, more resonant, as if it came from far underground. The path led to a break in the valley wall, a narrow fissure that might have been caused by an ancient earthquake. Water flowed from the fissure, black in the failing light. The opening was wide enough to squeeze through, and I could feel a draft of warmer air coming from inside. I took out my phone to use as a flashlight, but the screen remained dark. The battery had been full that morning, but now it was completely dead. I had a choice to make. Spend the night in the open valley, exposed to the weather and whatever was moving in the darkness, or push through the fissure toward what I hoped would be shelter. The sound of movement from up the valley made the decision for me. I turned sideways and began to edge through the gap in the rock. The passage twisted like a corkscrew, forcing me to contort my body to follow its path. The walls were slick with some kind of mineral deposits, and the air had a metallic taste that made me gag. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, the passage widened into a cave. The cave was massive, its ceiling lost in darkness above. But what stopped me cold was the floor. It was covered in ancient stone structures, walls, foundations, and what looked like altars, all half buried in centuries of debris. This wasn't a natural cave. This was something else entirely. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out details in the dim light that filtered down from somewhere above. The stonework was incredibly old, predating the Romans, perhaps even the Etruscans, and on the walls, barely visible beneath layers of mineral deposits, were paintings. They showed human figures, but something was wrong about their proportions. They were too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. And mixed among them were other figures, things that straddled the line between human and animal in ways that made my mind recoil. The cave complex was vast, with passages leading off in several directions. The sound of water was everywhere, but its source remained hidden. I moved carefully through the ruins, my hands trailing along ancient walls. The stone was worn smooth, as if countless others had followed the same path over millennia. That's when I noticed the handprints. They were pressed into the stone itself, as if the rock had been soft when they were made. Some were recognizably human, others weren't. They grew more numerous as I continued, covering the walls in overlapping layers, all of them leading deeper into the complex. The temperature began to rise, and the air grew thick with humidity. My clothes, soaked from the rain, now clung to my skin with sweat. The silence was absolute except for the omnipresent sound of water and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. I reached what appeared to be a central chamber. The ceiling opened to the sky far above, allowing in weak light from the clouded night sky. The chamber was circular, with a depression in the center that might once have held water. The walls were covered in more paintings, but these were different. They showed scenes of transformation, human figures changing into something else, their bodies twisting and elongating. A sound echoed through the chamber, the scrape of stone on stone. I spun around, but in the dim light, all I could see were shadows. They seemed to move independently of any light source, flowing across the walls like liquid. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath fogging in the air. The screams started again, but this time they were inside the cave complex, bouncing off the walls until it was impossible to tell their source. They were closer than ever, and now I could make out words within them. Ancient words in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. They spoke of change, of transformation, of the thin boundary between one state of being and another. I ran. I had no choice. I ran through the darkness, my hands scraping against stone walls, my feet stumbling over ancient flagstones. Behind me, the screams grew louder, and with them came the sound of pursuit. The click of claws on stone, the rasp of something dragging itself through narrow passages. I don't remember how I found my way out of the cave complex. My memories of those hours are fragmented, like scenes from a nightmare that don't quite fit together. I remember running until my legs gave out, crawling through spaces that seemed to shrink as I passed through them, feeling hot breath on the back of my neck. When I finally emerged, it was through a different opening than the one I had entered. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I found myself on a slope overlooking a valley I didn't recognize, but in the distance I could see lights, a town, civilization, safety. The descent to the valley floor was a blur. By the time I reached the road, the sun had risen fully. A passing farmer in an old Fiat stopped to help, concerned by my appearance. I must have looked half mad, clothes torn, hands bloody, face scratched and bruised. He drove me to the nearest town, where I learned I had somehow crossed over the mountain range and emerged on the other side, nearly 20 kilometers from where I had started. The police were called, and a search and rescue team was assembled to look for other hikers who might be lost in the area. I gave them the coordinates of the shepherd's hut, but when they reached the location, they found nothing but tumbled stones. There was no evidence of any structure ever having stood there. The cave complex, if it exists, has never been found. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've researched the history of the region, studied ancient myths and geological surveys. I've found fragments that might explain pieces of what I experienced. Underground rivers that could account for the water sounds, geological formations that might explain the cave complex, even historical records of similar experiences by other hikers. But none of it fully explains what I encountered in those mountains. The truth is, I'm no longer sure I want an explanation. Some things are better left unknown, some boundaries better left uncrossed. The mountains keep their secrets, and we would do well to let them. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that part of Italy. Sometimes, though, on autumn evenings when the light fails early and the wind carries strange sounds, I remember the shepherd's hut and what followed. And I wonder about that couple I met on the trail, about the man who looked at me with such horror. I wonder what he saw that day, and if it was the same thing that found me in the darkness beneath the mountains. Because the most terrifying thing about my experience isn't what I saw or heard. It's the certainty that something saw me too, and that it's still there, waiting in the ancient darkness beneath the Apuan Alps, where the boundaries between what is and what cannot be grow thin enough to break. It was the summer of 2012 and I was 14 years old, living a typical suburban life in the sprawling planned community of Shady Oaks. Our house backed up to a quiet cul-de-sac on the edge of the neighborhood, where manicured lawns and white picket fences gave way to a wide expanse of open fields and pastures. I had always been an active kid, forever racing around on my bike or rollerblading through the winding streets with my pack of neighborhood friends. But my favorite activity, the one that truly set my soul free, was going for long runs with my loyal dog Jasper. Jasper was a big, goofy German Shepherd Lab mix, with soulful brown eyes and an ever-wagging tail. For a dog his size, he was remarkably gentle and friendly. Jasper adored everyone he met, and his default greeting was to flop onto his back for belly rubs. But despite his sweet nature, he was fiercely protective of me. Every evening, as the sun began its slow descent, and the shadows grew long across the land, Jasper and I would set out for our nightly runs. Our favorite route took us down the paved biking and jogging trail that ran between the back fences of the houses and the expansive pastures of the Breezy Meadows horse farm. I loved that time of day, when the buzzing cicadas and chittering birds formed a symphony in the trees and the light turned soft and golden. With Jasper by my side, loping along with his big doggy grin and pink tongue lolling out, all my worries and cares faded away. We were free spirits, just a girl and her dog, our hearts filled with the simple joy of movement and the great outdoors. Night had fully fallen by the time Jasper and I headed out for our run that humid evening in late July. We'd gotten a later than usual start. I'd been caught up in an intense online Scrabble match against my internet bestie from 3 states over and lost track of time. It had to be approaching 10 p.m. by the time I finally laced up my running shoes, grabbed Jasper's leash, and slipped quietly out the back door. I knew my parents wouldn't be thrilled about me running so late if they caught me. But at 14, I was filled with the invincibility of youth. What could possibly happen to me here in my own neighborhood, with my 90-pound guard dog at my side? The moon was just a thin sliver that night, and heavy clouds masked the faint starlight. Normally, the pathway was lit by the warm glow spilling from the windows of the houses that backed up to it. But at this hour, most of my neighbors had already turned in for the night, leaving the trail shrouded in inky darkness. I flicked on my little palm-sized flashlight as we set off, the narrow beam cutting through the night just enough to illuminate the path directly in front of my pounding feet. But the darkness pressed in from all sides, almost a tangible thing. Usually so eager and exuberant on our runs, even Jasper seemed oddly hesitant as we started down the path. His gait was stiff, and his head swiveled constantly, hackles raised as if sensing some unseen threat. I soothed him and urged him on, assuming he was just picking up on my own unease with being out so late. As we went further down the trail, leaving the comforting lights of the neighborhood behind, a strange foreboding came over me. The shadows in the pastures seemed deeper, more menacing. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant nightbird call made me flinch. And then, in the weak beam of my flashlight some 20 yards ahead, I saw it. A dark, person-sized shape lying directly across the middle of the path. My heart lurched in my chest and I skidded to a stop, Jasper halting obediently at my side. What in the world? From this distance, it almost looked like... But no, it couldn't be a body. Not here. This was Shady Oaks. People didn't just turn up dead on the bike path. It had to be a garbage bag or discarded piece of clothing or something. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of the dimly lit lump. Then, slowly, it began to move. Terror jolted through my body like a bolt of electricity as the dark shape on the path unfurled itself and rose to its feet. Jasper let out a deep, menacing growl unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. It was a man, and he was now staggering straight towards us with alarming speed. The faint moonlight glinted off something in his hand. A knife? A weapon? My fear-addled brain couldn't make it out, but a scream rose in my throat. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet remained rooted as if the tar of the path had turned to quicksand, trapping me. Jasper's growl quickly turned to ferocious barks that echoed off the trees, but the figure continued its relentless advance. The pounding of heavy footsteps, the ragged breaths, they grew louder by the second as the gap between us narrowed. I was certain we were going to die. That this crazed man had been lying in wait, that he would catch me and do unspeakable things, leaving my body bloodied in the bushes for some horrified jogger to find in the clear light of dawn. I started to cry then, my body shaking like a dry leaf in a gale, hot tears coursing down my face. My fists clenched tight to Jasper's leash as if it were a lifeline, as if my loyal dog could save me from this living nightmare. And that's when Jasper sprang into action. As if sensing my total paralysis, he lunged to the end of his leash, putting his powerful body between me and our attacker. His barks reached a fever pitch, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl I'd never seen before. For a beat, the man actually hesitated, perhaps rethinking his choice of victim in the face of a suddenly aggressive 90-pound dog. That hesitation was all Jasper needed. With a great lunge, Jasper yanked me bodily around, his strength nearly pulling me off my feet. Spinning on his paws, he began to sprint back the way we'd come, leaving me no choice but to follow or be dragged. Finally shaken out of my paralyzing fear, I ran as I'd never run before, the leash cutting into my clenched palm, my legs pumping frantically to keep up with Jasper's powerful pace. Behind us, I could hear the heavy steps of the man as he gave chase, an angry bellow splitting the night. Faster and faster we ran, darting down darkened streets, cutting through yards as Jasper led me in a panicked zigzag route back towards home and safety. With every glance over my shoulder, I expected to see the man right there, his grasping fingers inches from my flying hair. But slowly, gradually, the sound of pursuit faded. Jasper never slowed though, running full out until we reached the familiar fence of our backyard. Only then did he allow me to fumble open the gate and usher us inside, where I promptly collapsed on the dew-soaked grass, gulping air into my burning lungs between great heaving sobs of residual terror. Jasper returned to my side, his cold nose nuzzling my wet cheek as if to reassure himself that we were okay, that he'd gotten me to safety. On shaking legs, I dragged myself up and into the house, double-checking every lock with trembling hands before crawling into my parents' bed like a child half my age. Jasper curled protectively around me. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house settling, every flicker of headlights through the curtains jolting me back to high alert. It felt as though the darkness itself had come alive, filled with nameless horrors just waiting for me to close my eyes before pouncing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who was that man? Why was he lying in wait on the dark path? What would he have done to me if Jasper hadn't been there? The possibilities made my stomach twist and my skin crawl. Part of me wanted to wake my parents, to sob out the whole terrifying story in the safety of my mother's arms, but a larger part held me back. Shame and guilt twisted inside me. I shouldn't have been out so late. I knew better. If I told them, they'd never let me go running at night again. Worse, they might not let me run alone at all. Jasper was my only outlet, my escape from the pressures of school, friends, growing up. I couldn't lose that. And in the light of morning, surely the events of the night before would feel less dire, more like a bad dream than a narrowly avoided catastrophe. But morning brought no relief from the suffocating fear. If anything, the cheerful sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows only made the memory of that inky darkness, that sense of malevolent intent, stand out in sharper contrast. I went through the motions of my day in a daze, flinching at every unexpected noise, seeing the shadowy figure from the path in every stranger on the street. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for a police officer to knock at the door asking about a prowler, or for whispered rumors to start flying around the neighborhood about an attack on the trail. But no one came. There were no rumors. It was as if the whole terrifying experience had been some sort of fever dream conjured by my adolescent mind. I started to wonder if I was going crazy, if stress and lack of sleep had caused me to hallucinate the whole thing. Yet Jasper's behavior told a different story. My normally boisterous, happy-go-lucky dog was suddenly watchful, anxious. He stuck to my side like glue, his hackles rising and a low growl rumbling in his chest every time someone passed by our yard. And every night, as darkness fell, he would plant himself firmly in front of the back door, refusing to budge for his evening walk. It was as if he could sense the evil lurking out there in the night, just waiting for another chance. Days passed in this manner, my paranoia growing by the hour even as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the prickling certainty that the man from the path was still out there, biding his time. I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep jumping at shadows and barely sleeping, lying to my parents about why I suddenly wanted all the curtains drawn tight as soon as the sun began to set. But I didn't know how to move forward, how to shake the cloak of fear that had settled over me that night on the trail. It turned out I wouldn't have to figure it out on my own. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. Plans that would drag my darkest fears into the glaring light of day, with consequences I could never have imagined. The breaking point came 5 days after that hellish night on the trail. I was in the kitchen, absently stirring a pot of mac and cheese, a childhood comfort food I'd been craving incessantly since the incident, when a commotion outside snapped me to full alert. Jasper started barking frantically, but for once there was no menace in it, only excitement. Curious, I turned off the stove and went to look out the window. Parked haphazardly in the middle of the street were 2 police cruisers, lights flashing. I watched in growing confusion as 4 officers poured out, heading straight for the house directly across from ours. Nosy neighbors were already gathering on their lawns, craning their necks for a better view. My heart started to pound, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Jasper and I stepped out onto the front porch just in time to see the officers, guns drawn, banging on the door of 4872 Sycamore Lane, the home of Mike Hastings. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Mr. Hastings, though few could claim to truly know him. He'd lived alone in that house for as long as I could remember, a quiet, reclusive figure rarely seen outside his own yard. Kids whispered that he was a ghost, or maybe a zombie, his sickly pale skin and distant, vacant stare lending credence to both theories. Adults tended to avoid him, put off by his mumbled, monosyllabic responses on the rare occasions conversation was unavoidable. But for all his oddities, Mr. Hastings had always just been a harmless fixture of the neighborhood. The weird, silent old guy who never quite met your eyes. No one feared him. Until now. A hush fell over the watching crowd as Mr. Hastings's front door swung open. He stood there, blinking in confusion, still in his ratty bathrobe despite it being late afternoon. The officers wasted no time, swarming up the steps and forcing him to his knees, barking orders I couldn't quite make out over the roaring in my ears. And then I saw them, the gloves. Bright blue latex gloves snapped onto Mr. Hastings' thin, pale hands. Gloves just like the ones my father, a doctor, wore at work. Gloves that had no business being on a reclusive retiree at 4 in the afternoon. No, not just like my father's gloves, I realized with a sudden, horrifying jolt of clarity. Those were my father's gloves. The box had gone missing from our garage a week ago. I watched in growing horror as the officers hauled Mr. Hastings to his feet, cuffing his blue-gloved hands behind his back. He was saying something, his voice thin and reedy, but the words were lost in the rush of my own panicked thoughts. It couldn't be. The man from the trail, the one who had chased us, tried to hurt me. It couldn't have been Mr. Hastings. He was odd, yes, but harmless. Wasn't he? Even as the question formed in my mind, an officer emerged from the house, holding up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a large, wicked-looking hunting knife, the blade stained with something dark. Bile rose hot and sharp in my throat. Jasper started whining, pressing his heavy bulk against my leg as if to reassure me, or perhaps himself. As Mr. Hastings was led towards one of the waiting police cars, he suddenly looked up, his eyes locking with mine across the street. In that moment, I knew. It was him, the man from the path, the monster who had tried to... I couldn't even finish the thought, because in his eyes, in that brief, terrifying instant of connection, I saw something that chilled me to my very core. Hunger, anger, and worst of all, familiarity. This wasn't random. It wasn't some misstep of fate, a predator and prey happening upon each other in the dark. No, this man knew me. He'd been watching me, waiting for me. As the police car door slammed on Mr. Hastings' contorted face, I stumbled back into the house, Jasper close at my heels. I made it to the kitchen sink just in time to lose the meager contents of my stomach, retching until nothing came up but bile. How long? How long had he been watching? And why? The questions circled my mind like carrion birds, picking at the tattered shreds of my sense of safety. Would the police find photos of me in his house? Had he been in my room, rifling through my things while I was at school? Even with him in custody, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the sickening knowledge that my stalker lived just a few steps away from my own front door. That he'd been there for years, silent and unseen. It was October 15th, 2019, when my life changed forever. I was 16, living with my parents in a remote part of Montana, where our closest neighbors were miles away and the wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction. Our home sat on the edge of dense forest land, backing up against the Bitterroot mountain range. The morning started like any other autumn day. The air was crisp, hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light mist clung to the ground as I prepared for my first solo hunting trip. My father had spent years teaching me the basics: tracking, weapon safety, survival skills. But this was different. This was my chance to prove myself. I remember checking my gear meticulously. My Winchester .30-30 rifle, ammunition, compass, water bottles, dried meat, and trail mix. My father's words echoed in my head. Stay aware of your surroundings. Mark your path. Trust your instincts. If only I had listened more carefully. The forest welcomed me with its familiar scent of pine and decaying leaves. As I ventured deeper, the morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, creating strange patterns on the forest floor. I noticed fresh deer tracks and began following them, my excitement overshadowing my better judgment. Hours passed as I tracked the deer. The morning mist had given way to overcast skies, and the temperature began to drop. I checked my watch, 11:45 a.m. My food supply was running low, and something felt off. The forest had grown quieter, the usual bird song replaced by an unsettling silence. I reached for my compass, only to feel my stomach drop when I realized it must have fallen from my pocket during my eager pursuit. The landmarks I thought I'd memorized now seemed foreign and distorted. The trees, which had always been familiar friends, now loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Looking up, I could barely see the sun through the thick cloud cover. Without this crucial reference point, my sense of direction began to falter. The reality of my situation started to sink in. I was lost in one of the most unforgiving wilderness areas in the country. The first wave of panic hit me like a physical blow. My breathing became shallow, and my hands trembled as I tried to rationalize my situation. In these mountains, black bears were common, especially during their pre-hibernation feeding frenzy. Moose, despite their seemingly docile appearance, were incredibly territorial and could easily crush a human. The elk were in rut, making the bulls particularly aggressive. But it was the coyotes that truly terrified me. Their howls had always echoed through our valley at night. But now, lost in their territory, the thought of encountering a pack made my throat constrict. They were known to become bold during the lean months, and October marked the beginning of their desperate search for food. I clutched my rifle closer, knowing I had only 5 rounds left. The weight of the weapon provided little comfort as the shadows around me seemed to deepen, despite it being midday. As afternoon crept towards evening, the temperature plummeted. My thin hunting jacket offered little protection against the biting wind that now howled through the trees. The forest had transformed into a maze of shadows and sounds, each crack of a branch sending jolts of adrenaline through my body. I remembered the stories of other hunters who had disappeared in these mountains. Some were found days later, hypothermic and delirious. Others were never found at all, becoming part of the forest's dark legends. The thought of joining their ranks clawed at my mind. The first sign of wildlife made me freeze. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I raised my rifle, my fingers numb against the cold metal. The sounds grew closer, then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. As dusk approached, the weather turned vicious. The wind picked up, driving icy rain through the trees. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and my clothes were soaked through. Each step became a battle against exhaustion and cold. My muscles screamed in protest as I pushed forward, though I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction. The forest floor had become treacherous, slick with wet leaves and hidden roots. Twice I fell, the second time twisting my ankle. The pain shot up my leg with each step, but I couldn't stop. To stop meant to die, and despite my growing despair, some primal part of me refused to give up. The wildlife around me seemed to sense my vulnerability. Something was tracking me. I could feel it. Occasionally I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain. The forest transformed into a nightmare landscape of black shapes and invisible threats. My flashlight cast weak shadows that seemed to dance and shift, playing tricks on my terror-stricken mind. Every sound became magnified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant howl of coyotes. I had never known true darkness until that night. The kind of darkness that seems alive, that presses against your eyeballs and fills your lungs with each breath. The cold had settled into my bones, and my teeth chattered uncontrollably. I found a relatively sheltered spot between 2 large trees and huddled there, my rifle across my knees. The sounds of the night forest grew closer. Eyes reflected my flashlight beam, some low to the ground, others at chest height. The coyotes were growing bolder, their yips and howls drawing nearer. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound explosive in the darkness. The forest fell silent for a moment, but soon the noises resumed, closer than before. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. Minutes stretched into hours as I fought against exhaustion and cold. My mind began to play tricks on me. I saw shapes moving in the darkness, tall, angular forms that seemed to shift and flow between the trees. The rational part of my brain knew they were just shadows, but primal fear had taken hold. The worst part was the waiting. Waiting for dawn, waiting for rescue, waiting for whatever was out there to finally show itself. My fingers had gone numb around the rifle, and I wasn't sure I could pull the trigger if I needed to. The cold had become a living thing, wrapping around me like a shroud. I thought about my parents, probably sick with worry by now. Would they find me? Would there be anything left to find? The forest seemed to whisper these questions back to me, the wind carrying them through the branches like a mocking laughter. The first hint of dawn came as a barely perceptible lightening of the eastern sky. I had survived the night, but my ordeal wasn't over. My body was stiff with cold, and every movement sent spikes of pain through my muscles. The twisted ankle had swollen inside my boot, making each step agony. As the light grew stronger, I heard something different. The distant sound of voices calling. At first, I thought it was another trick of my mind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. Search parties. They were looking for me. I wanted to run toward the voices, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I managed to raise my rifle and fire my last round into the air. The shot echoed through the morning stillness, and the voices changed direction, growing closer. When they finally found me, I was barely conscious. The search party, led by my father and local forest rangers, had been looking for me since sunset. They told me later that I had wandered nearly 15 miles from my starting point, deep into one of the most remote sections of the forest. The experience changed me forever. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had shown me its true face. The face of ancient, implacable wilderness that cares nothing for human life or safety. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the dead of night, heart pounding, thinking I hear the wind whispering through the trees and the distant howl of coyotes. I still hunt, but never alone. The forest taught me respect that day. Respect for its power, its mystery, and its absolute indifference to human suffering. Some lessons, once learned, can never be forgotten. In the autumn of 1962, deep in the heart of Mississippi, there lay a forgotten corner of the world known as So-So, near Rose Hill. This wasn't the Mississippi of tourist brochures or historical landmarks. This was the Mississippi of dark pine forests, red clay roads, and secrets kept for generations. I remember the story as my grandmother told it, her voice dropping to a whisper even decades later, her hands trembling slightly as she rocked in her old wooden chair. The tale had become part of our family's oral history, passed down like a dark heirloom, a reminder of a time when civilization was just a thin veneer over something much older and wilder. The poverty in So-So was grinding and absolute. Indoor plumbing was a luxury few could afford, and most families relied on creek water for their daily needs. The nearest doctor was 30 miles away, and most folks treated their ailments with home remedies passed down through generations. Mental illness wasn't understood, it was feared, hidden away, spoken of in whispers, if at all. The woman who haunted So-So's woods had a name once, though it was never spoken aloud. Born in 1920 to the Matthews family, she had started life as normally as any child. But as the years passed, her parents noticed something wasn't right. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact, would scream for hours without apparent cause. In today's world, she might have been diagnosed with severe autism or schizophrenia, but in 1920s rural Mississippi, she was simply touched. Her parents, overwhelmed and undereducated, did what many families did back then. They retreated into shame and denial. As she grew stronger and more difficult to control, they began leaving her alone for longer periods. Eventually, she disappeared into the woods altogether. Some said they'd seen her in the early years, a flash of movement between trees, a shadow at twilight. But as time passed, she became something else entirely. The transformation from human to creature was gradual but complete. Her hair grew wild and matted, her nails lengthened into claws, and her eyes developed a feral, blood-red cast from years of exposure to the elements. She learned to move silently through the undergrowth, to climb trees with inhuman agility, and most disturbingly, to mimic the call of a panther with chilling accuracy. The woods changed her, or perhaps revealed what she had always been. She became a predator, driven by hunger and instinct. The first child disappeared in 1945, a 7-year-old boy who had stayed too long at the creek. His body was never found. Over the next few years, more children vanished. The community whispered about panthers, but the older folks knew better. They had seen her, watching from the trees with those terrible red eyes. It was against this backdrop that my grandmother and great-aunt found themselves heading to the creek one evening in 1962. They were young then, 14 and 16, and had forgotten to fetch water earlier in the day. Their mother, stern and practical, had insisted they go despite the setting sun. "We need water for tomorrow," she had said, pressing the buckets into their hands. The creek was a quarter-mile through dense woods. In daylight, it was a peaceful place where women gathered to wash clothes and children played. But as dusk approached, shadows lengthened between the trees, and every rustle of leaves carried potential menace. The sisters walked quickly, their footsteps crunching on pine needles, the empty buckets banging against their legs. The water was still warm from the day's heat as they filled their buckets. They worked quickly, conscious of the deepening darkness and the watching woods. The journey back seemed longer, the loaded buckets growing heavier with each step. The forest had gone quiet. No bird song, no insect chorus, just the sound of their labored breathing and the slosh of water. They were nearly home when it happened. A movement caught their eye, something pale among the dark trees. Then she emerged, partially visible behind a massive pine trunk. Her face was barely human anymore, a mask of matted hair and wild eyes. But it was her mouth that frozen them in place, stretched into something between a smile and a snarl, showing teeth that had been filed to points. The sisters stood paralyzed as she tilted her head, studying them with predatory intensity. Then she opened her mouth and released a sound that haunted their dreams for decades to come, the perfect imitation of a panther's scream, rising and falling in the gathering darkness. It was a sound that contained decades of isolation, of feral existence, of hunger both physical and spiritual. They ran then, water sloshing from their buckets, hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the panther call echoed through the trees, following them all the way home. They burst through their front door, soaked and gasping, to find their mother waiting with a knowing look in her eyes. That was the last time anyone in our family saw her, but not the last time her presence was felt. The panther calls continued for years, growing more infrequent but no less terrifying. Children were kept close to home, especially after dark. The creek became a place of necessity rather than pleasure, visited quickly and never alone. The woman in the woods became a cautionary tale, a story told to keep children in line. But for those who had encountered her, like my grandmother and great-aunt, she represented something more. A reminder of how thin the line between civilization and savagery could be, how easily a human being could be lost to the wilderness. The woman presumably died sometime in the late 1970s. The panther calls ceased, and no more children disappeared. But her legacy lived on in the collective memory of So-So. The area has changed now. Indoor plumbing is universal, the creek is rarely visited, and the woods have been partially cleared for development. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the remaining pines, older residents swear they can still hear something that sounds almost like a panther's call. And mothers still warn their children not to linger too long in the woods, where the shadows are deep and old secrets still lurk among the trees. My grandmother never returned to the creek after that night. Even in her final years, when dementia had stolen most of her memories, she would sometimes grow agitated at sunset, speaking of red eyes in the darkness and the sound of a panther's call. Some experiences, it seems, are too profound to be forgotten, becoming part of our very bones, passed down through generations like a warning written in blood,